Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my Week 1 LPL overview and analysis video. It's finally LPL time. It's very rare that LPL is one of the last leagues to kick off here in the world. Essentially, it's the last league that we're covering here for a week number 1. That's very strange with it normally kicking off the year, but LPL took a little bit of time to get going here in 2024, and, you know, we had to wait a little bit for it, but it was definitely worth the wait. The excitement is absolutely still there. A lot of these teams are super stacked. If you want to know my thoughts and opinions on, you know, how I feel about the LPL and all the teams going into the year, you can check out the video linked up in the iCard right now. That's going to be a link to my primer and power rankings video, my preseason power rankings, and me going over all 17 teams in depth, talking about where I think their ceilings and floors could land, kind of giving you an idea of where I think these teams could, you know, be going into the year. You definitely check that out if you haven't already. It's a very in-depth analysis of the LPL teams going into 2024, but today we're going to be covering everything that happened in week number 1, all 17, I believe it's 17, best of 3 series. It's a lot of games, but that's the LPL. Every single week we cover it on this channel, and I want to know what you guys thought of it down in the comment section below. Were there any teams that, you know, surprised you in a good way? Any teams that surprised you in a bad way? Overachieved, underachieved? Any players that you were really interested in? Would just love to hear you guys' general thoughts and feedback on week number 1. Of course, if you didn't watch the games, this video is also for you. It's going to be going over every single game in week number 1, every single series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game or player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover at the end of the week. We're obviously going to update my power rankings. We'll be going from number 1 to number 17 and, you know, seeing how that has changed after 1 week of action, as well as going over my player of the week and my dud of the week for the entirety of week 1 in the LPL to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. That intro was long enough. I don't want to drag this out too long, and we get to start it off with day number 1 and kicking off our LPL year here in 2024. It's a fantastic opening series between Bilibili Gaming and Top Esports. You really couldn't ask for 2 more interesting teams to start off the year with. Both of them, you know, top tier teams. I had the number 1 and number 3 respectively, as you can see up on the screen next to their team names in my personal power rankings, and, you know, both of them making changes but not completely overhauling the roster in the offseason, with players like Knight coming in for Bilibili, 369 and Cream and Mako coming in for Top Esports. You know, a lot of interesting movement happening, but it is going to be Bilibili walking away with the early win here and, you know, starting their season off with a really, really nice win, a really strong start here against a good Top Esports team. It was 2-1. Top was able to get game number 2 here. It did have to go to a game 3, but Bilibili looks very scary as a unit. I put them number 1 in my power rankings for a reason. I don't think there is a roster in the world that you can say it has a higher mechanical upside than what Bilibili has. Maybe you can talk about teams like Gen.G, T1, JD Gaming potentially being higher floors, you know, more certain in terms of the output that they're going to put out, but for Bilibili, like, if everything goes right for this team, they could be the best team in the world. They could be comparable to a team like JDG last year or T1 last year by the end of the year. And we kind of saw that here in game number 1 or series number 1. They were really, really phenomenal. Player of the series was genuinely difficult for me to end up picking out because there were 3 players that I thought really dominated in this series. I ended up giving it to Knight in the mid lane because AD LeBlanc ended up really taking over in that game number 3. I think you could very realistically give this to On in the support position, who was awesome, especially on that Renata in game number 3. He was really good at being able to take over a lot of the map, moving around, being proactive, being On. You know, the On that we know, the On that we love. Didn't love the Zyra Khan in game number 2, though, so that definitely kept it out a little bit for me. And then I think June was also very much in consideration here, mostly for that brand in game number 1, where he just ran circles around Tion. I mean, I tweeted this out basically right before recording this, because LEC is going on right now as I'm recording this, but Brand is one of those picks where it's like, I don't really think it would work in pro. It doesn't feel like a champion that would work with more coordinated play, but every time we've seen it, it ends up doing super well, and June here is a really good example of that. He dominated game 1, but again, I ended up giving it tonight because AD LeBlanc really was just impossible for Top Esports to stop. Constantly in the side lane, constantly taking towers. Nobody on the enemy team was able to 1v1 it. Kareem got dominated in the laning phase. Knight did a really good job of exerting pressure, and this is the fear of Bilibili Gaming going into 2024, is you took a player in Yagao, who, yes, is fantastic for this team, was able to really enable this bot lane to play super aggro, was able to enable June and Bin to really play a lot more aggressive, and was more willing to take a back seat rather than gain a lot of resources. he's a great player. I'm not trying to take anything away from Yagao, but the mechanical ceiling of what Knight offers this team is just different than what Bilibili had. And for him to be able to, quite frankly, just win so hard without resources, like isolated in a 1v1 matchup, he was not perma-ganked this game by his jungler. He was not, perma-resource heavy, ignore the rest of the team, play towards me. That's not what Knight was in this game. He just was better than the person he was playing against. He was able to generate his own massive lead, and he was able to snowball the game out of control, and that's why, to me, he was player of the series. Again, if you want to give it to June, if you want to give it to On, I think both of those are relatively fine. Even Elk and Bin were pretty solid. Elk in particular was pretty solid here outside of the Xayah game in game 2, which just wasn't working. But Bilibili was really good in this first series. And then for Top Esports, there are some concerns. I'm not going to freak out too much because, again, they just lost to what I consider to be the best team in the LPL. So I don't want to sit here and lambast them and say that, their problems can't be fixed. But, there are some things to take note of. I think mid-jungle definitely got a bit outplayed here in their first series. Tian is going to get my dud of the series to start off the year. I'm still pretty high on Tian. I think he generally gets a bad rap by the community, but I think he will stabilize, especially going into, worse teams as the year goes on. That's just generally how Tian ends up playing, but it is worth noting that he was not very good. He was really bad in game number 1, and he did not do anything to be proactive in the early game on the Lee Sin in game 3, which is inevitably what ended up, kind of leading into them just falling off as the game went further and further along, allowing the AD LeBlanc, allowing the Renata in particular to move around the map and create a lot of, chaos and havoc. I think Tian was really at fault for that, but Kareem also really got outplayed, and this was my biggest concern when it came to Top Esports this year was, is Kareem going to be able to step up? Is he going to be good enough to be on a team like this where I think, they expect to make Worlds? This is not a team that has any expectations outside of being, a team that could compete to win the LPL and will be one of the top 4, maybe top 2 teams in the league. And, Kareem needs to step up to that. He wasn't good enough in this first series. The Azir did not look very clean. Obviously, it's not one of those champions that I think he is known for playing at a super high level, but he had the option to go towards those champions. They weren't always banned out. They were on the table, available to be picked, and they wanted to go for something a little bit more stable like the Azir as they transitioned into the late game, and Kareem just wasn't good enough. So that's something to keep in mind. Jackie Love and Mako were really good in game 2 on the Kalista Renata, but outside of that, the Kalista just did not work. Getting dove on red side is really easy in the bot lane right now, and that was never more apparent than in this series where Jackie Love and Mako were just a bit, overmatched in that side. 369 I thought was genuinely phenomenal in this series, and he was clearly the best player on Top Esports throughout all 3 games, in my opinion, but there's only so much you can do on tanks on the top side when the rest of your team's damage is just not there, and that was unfortunately the problem. So jungle mid definitely needs to stabilize. I feel more confident that Tian is going to have better series as we continue onwards, but Kareem has to be better. He did not look like he was on the same level as a player like Knight in this series, and that's going to be a problem if this team does want to compete to be one of the best teams in the entire league. But for Bilibili on the other side, great way to start the year. This team looks exactly how you would want them to look. Coming off of winning Demacia Cup, a lot of momentum rolling for Bilibili right now. They definitely continued that with this first win, and I think it's very encouraging that it was a lot of members of the team and not just 1 or 2. And then moving on to our second series of opening day here in the LPL, and it's a pretty classic rivalry, but both kind of going through some different phases right now. It's RNG taking on Edward Gaming, and RNG picks up the win here, their first win of the year, obviously, because it's the first series of the year for both of these teams, but I gotta be honest, man, this was a sloppy series from both of these teams. I am pretty notably lower on both of these teams, I would say, than consensus. I think maybe I'm closer to EDG. I think generally people are pretty, somewhere in the middle on EDG. I had them at number 10, right on the border of, playoffs for me, because I could see this team figuring something out and being really good, or I could see this team, falling and failing and, falling out of playoffs. I think both are pretty realistic possibilities for EDG, but, I'm definitely lower on RNG. Everybody was saying they are definitely in top 5. Originally, I did not have them in my top 5, moved them in there after Demacia Cup, where it felt like a lot of the teams that were kind of around them in that spot just weren't as good, but man, this series was weird and not particularly good from either of these teams. It's certainly a bit concerning. Definitely worse for EDG, where it feels like I don't know how this team is going to win against good teams over the course of this year, but at least, a nice win for RNG. We'll talk about it now. Top side of the map really did carry them, I think, in this series. You can talk about Ming having a pretty decent series, but outside of that, it was Breathe and it was Wei creating a lot of the action for RNG. I'm going to give player of the series to Breathe on the top side. It felt like he was the one that was creating most of the good plays, especially in the back half of the series. Wei was awesome in game 2, but Breathe on that Kennen in game 3 essentially won the series for RNG. A lot of great engages, a lot of really good flanks coming in from him, and generally it was RNG's macro that ended up winning them this final game of the series. series where EDG just got completely out macroed and they made some really bad decisions down the stretch, which allowed RNG to come back and really be able to win this game. I think Breathe being in the right place at the right time in a lot of those situations is really good. And genuinely, there are not two players that I would rather see win games for RNG right now than Breathe and Wei. I want to see them stabilize the top side of the map. You can allow your, players like Tong Yuan and a player like LWX who might be, looking for a bounce back to grow a bit as the year goes on. Neither of them were awful, by the way. We will get to that, but Breathe and Wei were definitely the ones that I think, we're creating a lot of the advantages and a lot of the playmaking tools that RNG were using to win the game. Wei would have gotten player of the series if it weren't for some bad engages that he made in game 3. I thought he was amazing in game 2 and really did kind of separate RNG a lot in that game, was able to get a really big lead early on the Vi, was able to just kind of destroy the Maokai in that matchup and just kind of snowball the game out of control from there, which is obviously great. But game 3, this game could have been over a lot quicker if Wei had actually played it a little bit cleaner towards the back half. His scoreline was still pretty good and he was obviously impactful in fights, but I just don't think the macro was very much there for him. This was a problem last year for him as well, and so I just want to see him clean up some of these mistakes. Tong Yuan, mechanically speaking, was good, but I mean, truly, he didn't do a whole ton. Fisher did not contest him in any way in terms of the early game prio, and, Tong Yuan just kind of had a free laning phase and just got to win the game. I wasn't super impressed by his performance, but he did play well. LWX, I think, was fine. A couple of mechanical mistakes here and there, similar to what I said about Tong Yuan. Didn't exactly dominate in the way that you would want to see him. I thought Ming was definitely the more impactful player out of the bot lane here, but LWX was still solid, and certainly, you're just looking for a player that can capitalize on a lot of things that, these really good playmakers create in the bot lane. That was something you really didn't have last year with LP. He just wasn't good enough to be able to capitalize mechanically speaking, and you're hoping that LWX is just a straight up improvement to that. I think he will be, and I think this series is a good start. I just don't know if he's going to be that all-pro guy that everybody seems to be anointing him as. I think this series is a pretty good example of what I would expect LWX to be for this team moving forward, but generally, okay series by RNG. Maybe you hope it's a little bit cleaner next time, but, at the end of the day, a win's a win, and you're going to take that to start the year. Then for EDG, this team's macro is just abysmal. I mean, that really is the takeaway from this series, is that the young players are just, they're going to have to learn. They're going to have to grow. It is not going to be a finished product already. As much as players like Fisher and Leave and, Vampire, apparently they're touted. Fisher and Leave in particular, they're pretty hyped up, as I've talked about. They're not quite there yet, as we've seen. Leave is somebody who we've seen at this level in the past, and he's been good, but he was not good in this series. The bot lane in general was not very good for EDG, constantly in the wrong spot, constantly making decisions to go in and be super aggro in the 2v2 when they don't have any prio, when they don't have any reason. They're constantly caught out for it. I think you could reasonably give dud of the series to either of those two. I give it to Vampire because it felt like he was the one making more actively bad decisions, but Leave's positioning was really bad in this series, and so whatever you want to say about those two, it was not good. Fisher was all right, I guess. He was really bad in game 2 on the Azir, was definitely better in game 3, was trying to keep that game alive in terms of damage, but he was the one who kind of threw that game away at the end of game 3 with that miserable engage onto Ming, onto the set in the back half of the game, and so, a lot to learn from him. Jeje was not particularly good, super inactive on the Maokai, especially in that game number 2 where he essentially got jungled circles around by Wei on the Vi. Really, really bad game, and Ale was by far the best player on EDG, but only so much you can do in the top lane, only so much you can actually do on champions like Jax or Aatrox. The Jax game in game 1 was actively a game-winning Jax game, but it's just, he didn't have the carry power to do it again for the rest of the series, and so I don't know about this EDG team. Their macro looks horrendous. They could be one of the worst macro teams in the LPL if they play like this, but hopefully the talent can work through. This is still, first series for a lot of these young players. Fisher's never really been given a spot in the LPL. Vampire's super new to competitive, and so you're going to give him some leeway at the beginning, and obviously Leave and Jeje have some things they need to work through. I just need to see them work through it before I start to believe this team's upside, because this was a really bad first showing in my opinion. But for RNG, glad you got the win. I still want to see a lot more from this team. This didn't really do anything to dissuade any of my worries. You beat a team that had 0 macro, and you still almost lost to them, and so would love to see you clean some things up a bit, but at least the top side of the map, at least the more stable, long-term veterans on this team are at least playing at a competent level. Would love to see players like Tong Yuan and LWX step it up as we continue to go throughout the split, but it was good enough for today, which I guess is good enough for now. And now moving on to day number 2, and we got to kick day 2 off with a pretty slow, pretty boring series. Not a very exciting one. It was OMG taking on WE, and OMG is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. Nice first win of the season for them. You're really happy to see that. WE looked completely lifeless in this one. We will talk about that. But, as per usual, I think a lot of the discourse surrounding this has been, pretty typical LPL discourse. No offense. Love you guys in the comment section below. LPL fans are very passionate, but, you guys aren't the ones I'm talking about. It's a lot of the people on social media, on Reddit, on Twitter that are, let's just say, pretty traditionally overreactors. That's what we've kind of seen. When you think of LPL discourse, you think of overreactions, you think of, very quick, like, oh, 2 games, that must mean that this is how this team is going to play the entire split. Obviously, I'm going to try to quell that a bit. One of the things that I'm kind of known for on this channel is trying not to overreact, try not to be a recency bias, try not to see a team's first 2 games of the season and say that, it's doomed. Nothing can possibly happen towards this team. But I do have to be honest, this is a pretty bad way to start the year for WE. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you guys. Like, this was bad. This was a boring set of games, and a lot of that was because WE just chose not to play. But I see a lot of takes that WE is they're in for a long year. This team's never going to win any games. Well, let me say why that's probably not just the guaranteed thing that a lot of people say it is right now. But let's talk about OMG first and foremost, actually, because we talk about winners first. First of all, there was a substitution, quote unquote, a change in roster that I was certainly not expecting going into the year. Abel is not starting for this team. I don't really know why. Starry is in here. There were rumors that Starry was going to be the AD carry for this team, but it was announced that Abel was coming back. He played in Demacia Cup, and so we're like, okay, well, Abel's going to be back for this team. The strength of this team is probably going to be the bot side, and I like Angel. Cube is fine. Zhao Feng could probably grow as a rookie. This was a team that I considered similar to WE last year because they had a stable bot side, and you could see some upside in their solo lanes, but nope, Abel is out. Starry is in. It ended up working here in series number 1, but I think that had more to do with WE. I'm really not all that sold by OMG, but it's worth noting that Starry was playing here, and he will be starting for OMG, but I think a lot of the success came through the solo lanes in this series, which is a good sign for OMG. I'm going to give player of the series to Angel in the mid lane. I'm really excited to see him pick up right where he left off last year on NIP. Obviously there are a lot of comments that are like, I don't really understand why Angel is playing in the mid lane, why they didn't promote their LDL mid laner, and I get it, right? Like, this team is going for a bit of a youth movement. You're bringing in Zhao Feng, you're bringing in Starry, you're going for something that's a bit more akin to, what EDG is doing rather than trying to compete like you did last year with a growing core. But Angel's a pretty good player, and he's coming off of one of the best splits of his entire career for NIP, was genuinely a carry for that team. People forget that they made playoffs, and they made playoffs basically off the back of Angel being the best player on that team by a country mile, even with the bot lane being miserable. So it's nice to see Angel showing back up here on OMG and continuing to look really good into Fofo, who is a pretty competent mid laner. He didn't look super competent in this series. I mean, he didn't make any mega mistakes. He was really bad in that final team fighting game too, but, Angel was just better than him in a lot of this series, and LeBlanc already looks like it's going to be one of the highest priority picks here in the LPL, and he wasn't the only player. I was really intrigued by Zhao Feng in the jungle. This is a great debut performance from the rookie coming in here. Really didn't know what we were going to get out of him. He was my last ranked jungler going into the year because his LDL tape is just super limited. He was barely a player at the LDL level. Obviously, they like his tools, they like his tape, but he was able to get some pretty strong leads here. The Jackson game 1 was great. That was really the one that he's getting a lot of the praise for. I think Hang was miserable in game 2, and he was able to just kind of jungle around him on the Maokai, which is great. Like, you're happy to see that, but the Jax was really able to take over a lot of those team fights, and you're really, you're excited because this was a player that I think whatever you got from him was kind of house money. You really didn't know what you were going to get because he had such limited tape, but it looked really good in the first series, so good for them. Cube was really good on the top side, was definitely better than Wayward. Bit of a revenge game for Cube, having played for WE last year, and Starry and PP God, I think, did everything they were supposed to do. Starry didn't make any fantastic plays, but he didn't make any mistakes either, and that's all you need to do when your top side is winning. So for OMG, like, it's a good look. I would have wished to see them play somebody that was a bit more aggressive. They were never really challenged in this series, but winning it nonetheless is still good. And then for WE on the other side, I mean, just miserable. I mean, a complete lack of proactivity, similar to a team like Rogue, as we've talked about in the LEC over the course of this year, just super slow, playing scaling team fight and not really making any plays and slowly losing the game is kind of what happened. And that's the opposite of what I think is the strength of their players, which is why I think that this isn't something that I'm expecting to see from them over the course of an entire split. For a team like Rogue, as we've talked about in the LEC, they have a lot of players who like to scale into the late game, Larson, Marcoon, they're team fight oriented. WE is not like that. Hang is an early game player. Fofo likes to be aggro in the early game. Prince likes to be aggro in the early game. I just don't expect this to be what WE does over the course of an entire year. I think this was more of an outlier because this wasn't how they played in Demacia Cup either when we saw this, group of 5 play together. I just think this was a bad day from them, and that's going to happen every once in a while. Hang is going to get my dead of the series, was completely outjungled. That game 2 was awful from him on the Vi, but I think you could give this to Wayward, who just walked up and played Udyr and died in every single fight, did nothing. Prince had some mechanical misplays that were, catastrophically bad for WE, and Wandy did literally nothing on the Renata, and Fofo just kind of slowly lost the game on the Azir. But again, I think this was kind of atypical from what you would expect from these players in particular, which is why I'm holding out hope. Now, if this just becomes what WE is over the course of this split, that's when I start to get worried, and obviously this is a concerning loss, but to all the people like doom saying that WE could never be a playoff team, they're gonna be awful, again, I think it's an overreaction after 2 games. They were 2 really bad games, but I need to see what else this team does before I just anoint them as the worst team in the LPL. But nice win for OMG. I'm just waiting to see what both of these teams look like in a different series. This felt like, kind of a weird one to kick off the year for both of them, and it didn't really tell me a whole ton about either of these teams. I think the most notable thing is that Angel continues to play well, is that Zhao Fang actually looked pretty competent at this level. Those are the takeaways that I want to have from this series, not so much the WE kind of running it down. I think OMG's positives are definitely something that I think could be repeatable. We'll just have to see if they are as we continue to go forward this year. And then moving on to our second series of day 2 here, and a battle between 2 teams that definitely went the more import route this offseason. Anyone's Legend taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and AL is going to pick up the 2-0 series win, which is obviously super nice for them. Again, I don't want to sit here and just talk about like community sentiment and Reddit threads and yada 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 all the time, but I do think a lot of the narratives that kind of shape people's thoughts on Eastern regions, in particular, the LPL and the LCK, are from a lot of these Reddit threads, are from, a lot of social media interactions, are from, what a lot of the prominent people in the community end up saying about these series, and I just want to, throw my own little spin on it, and so I'm sorry if you guys are annoyed by me talking about this, but I've done it the past couple of years, and nobody really seems to be all that frustrated by it, so I'll talk about it now. The big narrative kind of surrounding this is what happens when you import. This is what happens when you, stick 2 low-level imports onto a team. You deserve to lose. This organization's in the trash, yada, yada, yada. But let's praise AL for bringing in Krako and Kale. Like, I don't know how I can express the hypocrisy of that statement, but I think Dectum in Life, obviously had some upside here for FPX. It didn't work out in game number 1, but it's the overreactions that I was talking about. It's watching 2 games and saying, this must be what the team is going to be like. Now, I'm more concerned about FPX than I am about WE. That is absolutely the case, but I think it's just really funny to see all these people, basically the only narrative surrounding this series being, why are we importing third-rate Korean players into the league and just losing for it, when it's the same people that are now praising Krako and Kale on the other side, when ostensibly in the offseason, these were the same imports. Like, Krako and Kale were just as bad as Life and Dectum were last year in terms of, what they were performing like. And so it's very funny to see the conversation kind of surrounding this. But let's go ahead and talk about this series in particular. I don't want to get too, critical of the community, because at the end of the day, the community is the community. The LPL community is always going to overreact to whatever game they saw in front of them, and that's just how it is going to be on social media. It's what it's been like the last few years. That's a big reason why I started this channel. So let's talk about what I actually thought of this series. I'll give you my actual analysis. Sorry for the rant. Player of the series for me is going to go to Krako. I think this is pretty up in the air. AL genuinely just looked good across the board. A lot of really positive signs coming out from AL. I think you could give this to Krako, who was amazing. I thought he controlled the tempo of this series incredibly well. Maybe he was a little bit more of a passenger in game 2, but I still thought he did a great job of enabling his carries in that second game on the Sejuani. His team fighting was excellent in this series, and that game 1 on the Maokai was just a masterclass coming in from Krako on how to control the game as an engaged tank. That's something that we're really not seeing a lot of, especially into these more aggressive early game junglers like the Xin Zhao right now in the meta. It's really good to see Krako say, no, actually, you still can have a pretty big impact on the game, even when you play something like Maokai. Krako was awful last year for DRX. Basically, all the positives that he had built up into his career leading into last year had kind of washed away. He was benched at times. It looked a little bit better by the end of the year, but it was really interesting to see what he was going to look like in his first series here for AL. He passed the test in Series 1. Obviously, he was Rookie of the Year in the LCK in 2021 for a reason. Over a player like Owner, he was a mega carry that almost got Live Sandbox to Worlds in 2022 as well. And so, you feel pretty good about Krako as a player, and it's really good to see him kind of get back to some of the more comfort comfort picks and, comfort styles that he had been on, previously to 2023. Harry was also really good on the Cassante in both of these games, specifically in game 2. He just gabbed Xiaolahu in lane both of these games really hard. He was the better top laner, and you want to see that growth coming out from Harry. He had really good moments, but they were very sporadic over the course of last year. You wanted to see the consistency grow from him. This is a good sign, at least to start the year. Xiaolahu probably had the best split of his career in summer of last year after really never having it come together as this super hyped prospect. Looks like he's kind of fallen back to the wayside, at least at the start of this year. Harry definitely outclassed him. Hope and Kale were great. Kale was fantastic in the support position, but Hope did a great job of capitalizing on all the setup that Harry and specifically Krako were able to do for him, and Shanks was solid in the mid lane. This was just an overall good performance from AL. Basically everything you wanted to see. And then for FPX on the other side, bot lane was a disaster. That's really going to be the takeaway, I think, for a lot of people. Dectum and Life did not look particularly cohesive. Dectum's build in Game 2 is a major question mark. Lethality Kai'Sa into this comp is certainly a decision, but Swain Pike in Game 1 is also certainly a decision. Dud of the series has to go to Life. He was awful, especially in Game 1 on the Pike. This looks like 2023 Life. You were hoping for the bounce back here. Dectum actually looked really good towards the end of the year when he was playing in Challengers League, and so there was reason to believe that bringing these two in could be a positive for FPX that they could play towards these two in the bot lane, but, Life is playing a lot more like he did in 2023 than he did in 2022. Him and Krako are actually kind of on similar trajectories, right? Really good players that just did not have good last years. Very different directions here. Krako looked good in this series. Life did not look good. You're hoping that he can figure something out, but it looks like the confidence is shot at the moment. Dectum certainly didn't play better, but I do think he's getting more criticism than he deserves. Life was a pretty big anchor in this series for both of them. Moyen was pretty bad in game number 1 in the Xin Zhao, so they sub him out. After game 1 for Milky Way, we knew this was going to be kind of more of a 6-man roster. I like Milky Way more. I said that in the primer. I will continue to say that here, and I think that opinion was reinforced. Milky Way was definitely better on the Nocturne in game 2 than Moyen was in game 1. Xiaolahu got completely outplayed. He was a dud of the series candidate, and Care was trying to win the game in the mid lane. He just didn't really have any help. Kind of the story of Care's career up until this point. And so this feels like the FPX team that's existed over the last couple of years. Honestly, it feels like nothing has changed. Dectum is playing exactly like LWX did, where he's going to get scapegoated for a couple of things, but he's also not really going to push this team forward. The support position might be a little bit worse, but jungle might actually be a little bit better if Milky Way can come in and be something. Xiaolahu is Xiaolahu. He's never going to put it together for a consistent period of time. FPX looks bad, but I had them ranked as pretty bad. 15th, bottom 3 in my power rankings. I saw this coming, and I'm not really surprised to see them get destroyed here. And I like AL. I was a bit more concerned with what their floor was, which is why they came in at 12 instead of like 10 or 11. But this team has playoff upside, absolutely for sure. Hope and Kale looked really good, but it was Krako and Harry that really, gave me confidence in this series. If they can bring that momentum and that confidence into the rest of this season, it's going to be pretty big for AL because I think this team is very interesting to watch. And then moving on to day number 3 here. We're getting closer to the middle of the week, and we got to kick off day 3 with a matchup between Ninjas in Pyjamas and LGD Gaming that NIP pretty cleanly is able to win. You would hope that game number 1 was a little bit more of an outlier than it was kind of the norm, and game 2 definitely was a lot more confident of a win for NIP, but generally, this was a good series from them. I think all of their players looked fine. Again, NIP was one of the teams that I think looked pretty good in the Demacia Cup kind of early season breakdown. LGD was another team that kind of surprised people with how good they looked in that tournament. I wasn't exactly sure how much that was going to translate outside of best of ones, but, Bertle and Meteor continued to look really good, and Haichao had a very good tournament, so, maybe there were some takeaways, and I think a lot of that ended up translating, but the problem is they have probably one of, if not the worst bot lane in the LPL, and so it's just going to be kind of hard to win games when you have that, but for NIP, it's the top side of the map. It's the OMG boys coming in to dominate this series and really carry them across the finish line. Like I said, game 1 was actually pretty close, and you really wouldn't have expected that. Game 1 probably shouldn't have been as close as it was. Meteor, Haichao, they were keeping it close because of their engages. The Yone was actually pretty strong, and Bertle was doing a really good job on the Cassante of engaging and setting up for a lot of these plays to end up happening, but one big rel engage later, and all of a sudden the game is over, and NIP is walking into the Nexus and ending it. Aki is going to get my player of the series because of that. He basically single-handedly won game number 1. Obviously, there was a lot of damage coming out from the Xayah for Photic, from, Rookie on the Azir, although you would love to see him potentially play that champion a bit better. Some of the mechanics were just not there. Even Shanji on the Aatrox was good. But it was the rel that kind of saved the game, in my opinion, and it's really nice to see Aki continuing that growth that he made a lot over the course of the year for OMG. Him and Shanji were the two best players on OMG last year, in my opinion. Good to see that carry over into 2024, at least so far. Shanji was, of course, the other player that you wanted to consider here, mostly for Kashanji in Game 2, where he was the best player in that second game, where they did dominate a bit harder. So whoever you wanted to give it to, Aki for saving Game 1 and really being the one to push them over the edge, or Shanji for being the kind of catalyst for them to be able to win that game number 2. Whoever you want to give it to, I think is fine. Photic was actually pretty good in this series. You just need him to be pretty good, right? He didn't make any major plays. He didn't go out there and create a lot for the team, but this is the role that he needs to fill. He needs to just be this big damage dealer in the back half of fights. The Lucian in particular in this series was exactly what they needed him to be, which was a solid, mid-game damage dealer. Somebody who is just in the right place at the right time, isn't creating a ton for the team, but isn't making mistakes either. That's all Photic needs to be, because your top side is good enough to create those plays for you multiple times throughout the game. If you capitalize on them, they're going to be fine. Zhuo continues to be solid. If there was a player that looked a little shaky, it was Rookie at times, but mostly it was just in lane. Honestly, I think Rookie got a lot more hate than he deserved in this series. He didn't really make a ton of mistakes. I just think Haichao looked awesome in this series, and honestly, I'm starting to buy into the Haichao hype. I don't know how much that's going to last as we continue to go throughout the split, but Haichao outplayed Rookie in a lot of the 1v1s in terms of laning in this series, and you just got to give him a lot of credit for that. So credit to Shanji and Aki. I think Photic and Zhuo did their job. Rookie was good enough for you to be able to win with. This was the NIP that we saw in Demacia Cup, and it's good to see them kind of run it back here. And then for LGD, I think this team is bad. I think it's very clear that this team is bad, and a lot of that is their bot lane, but honestly, they do have some good moments. If Meteor didn't mess up that top gank, I think that the series was potentially winnable for LGD, which is pretty crazy to say, but I think him, Bertle, Haichao, like the top 3 members of this map, I think are playable as players, and I don't know if this is going to be a guaranteed last team. I think the thing that is going to keep them closer to the bottom of the standings is this bot lane, which just does not seem playable at this level. They go Senatom Kench 2 games in a row, and both times those champions are almost completely useless throughout the entirety of the game, specifically in that game number 2, where the Senna just got ran over. Kepler is going to get dud of the series. When you're getting dominated by Photic and Zhuo, it's really not a particularly good sign, and the concern here is that this is the Kepler that we saw in 2023 and not the Kepler that we saw in 2022 when he was playing for ThunderTalk. He kind of came into the LPL, was looking pretty good with Yao Yao, kind of pushed ThunderTalk over the edge towards the back half of that year. You're going into 2023, doesn't have a job, ThunderTalk goes out and upgrades and gets Huanfeng. Sure, fine. Kepler goes back to the LDL. He's awful in the LDL. Like, he is one of the worst AD carries in the LDL from what I watched, at least on a team that actually had expectations. And it doesn't look like it's going to be better here for LGD. I really don't see why they would pick him up, especially after the year he had last year. This was not an encouraging sign. Jin Zhao was, predictably nothing on the Tom Kench, and so you're not particularly surprised by that. But like I said, Haichao was actually really good in this series. Meteor played this series really well up until that major mistake on the top side, and Bertle, outside of game number 2 was pretty good. He was actually pretty solid on the Cassante in game 1. So, not the worst for LGD losing to a team like NIP, because NIP is genuinely good. If Rookie can stabilize a bit more, maybe perhaps have a better laning phase, this team's actually really solid. Photic and Zhuo did what they needed to do. If they can keep that up, Shanji and Aki are good enough to be the 2 best players on a team that goes to Worlds. I truly believe that. So, gonna be interesting to see what happens with NIP, but there was a reason I raised them up after Demacia Cup, and it's because I really do believe in the top side of this map. And now moving on to our second series of day number 3 here, and it was 2 teams that definitely needed to prove a lot here. It was Ultra Prime taking on Invictus Gaming, and Invictus is going to pick up the win here. This isn't a huge surprise. IG should be the better team here. Ultra Prime coming in as my pretty clear number 17 team in my power rankings, the pretty clear worst team in the LPL going into the year, but, IG certainly proved that, I think, in the first series. A lot of things going wrong for Ultra Prime, a lot of things going right for Invictus, although not everything being perfect. First things first, again, another kind of surprise starter in the bot lane, very similar to what we talked about with OMG instead of On, at least for the start of this year. It's Xiao Yueji, and, we've seen Xiao Yueji at different periods of time throughout the last couple of years in the LPL. I've liked his tape. I've hyped him up a bit. I like On's tape a lot too. I thought he was a lot worse in summer, but still, there is good there in On's tape, and him and Wink clearly have good chemistry. It's very interesting that they want to go in this direction with Xiao Yueji so early on into the season, but I can't criticize them too much for at least the decision to do that. Now, we'll get into it. He was clearly the worst player on Invictus Gaming in this series, and that definitely raises some concerns, but at least for now, I understand maybe wanting to go in that direction, but lucky for them, they kind of got bailed out because the rest of this team was actually really good in this game. The macro of Invictus, a lot better than I was anticipating. That was something that at times they were very good at last year. When they were playing really bad teams, they were often just able to out-macro them and kind of, beat them in the mid-game and just, run away and snowball the game out of control. And and that kind of is what happened here. This is very reminiscent of early spring Invictus from last year, which I think is a good sign. Player of the series, no brainer. This one's going to Cryan in the mid lane. Amazing series coming in from Cryan. I know that Azir is so boring, and I know that people don't want to continuously see this champion at a super high level, but man, is he not just like the most consistent mid laner in the game right now. You know, a lot of people are really kind of gravitating towards AD LeBlanc. Knight made it look super strong in the first series that we had here, but not everybody is Knight. And as much as I like Uakai, especially on Assassins, that's definitely more of his, you know, shtick. Cryan was way better and way more useful on the Azir in game number 2 here. He was awesome in game 1 on the Talia, doing a ton of damage, moving around the map, just generally looking great. This was the Cryan that, you know, we were all promised. I mean, if he's going to continue to be a really interesting mid lane player, I mean, Invictus could be a lot better than I'm expecting, because one of the big concerns that I had for this team was, do they have somebody that can win game on game on game? I was hoping that that could be on in the bot lane, or Zhao Yueji. It could be either of the AD carries for this team, but if it's Cryan in the mid lane, that definitely changes the outlook of this team, and I think it definitely raises the ceiling of what IG could offer. And what also raises the ceiling is, oh my god, Tianjin played, and he didn't flip the game at 5 to 8 minutes. That is amazing. That's a great thing to say, even for the good. A lot of times last year, what Tianjin would do is make this super risky play at around 8, 9, 10 minutes into the game, and then it would either go super well and the team would kind of snowball out of control, or more often than not, it would go really poorly and the team would just kind of lose the game. That's what happened a lot in the summer split. Really nice to see him just like play his role in this one, especially on the Rel in game 1, but even the Lee Sin, something a little bit more aggressive in the game 2. All he did was really set his team up to be able to win the game. He didn't flip the game. He didn't decide whether they won or lost on his own. That's a positive. That's an improvement. That is more team-oriented play from Tianjin, which is nice. You should know me looked fine in the top lane, got to play one of the weaker top laners, and so you live with that. Wink, I think, made some awesome engages towards the end of game 2, and like I said, Zhao Yueji's positioning was pretty bad throughout a majority of the series, but at the very least, he was staying aggressive and trying to deal damage. That's something that, you know, is at least a positive, but he was pretty clearly the worst player on this team, and so it'll be interesting to see if they want to stick with him or if they want to maybe go back to On, you know, now that you're not playing Ultra Prime and you probably can't get away with it in the same way. Again, it's not the hardest game of all time, but they did show up and they did do what they were supposed to do, which is win this very cleanly. And then for Ultra Prime on the other side, this team sucks. I really don't see a lot of upside. I really don't see a lot of potential in what they're going to offer over the course of 2024. Dud of the series is going to go to Uakai in the mid lane. Just got completely outclassed by Cryan in basically every matchup that they played. The Azir in game 1, you know, looked all right, but it was really the LeBlanc in game 2 that looked completely and utterly useless. Going into a champion that essentially does what AD LeBlanc does, but better in the Azir, it just didn't end up working out. Uakai is somebody that I do like for this team because he is somebody that can be a resource carry. You can play towards him, but man, did it not work out here in game number 1. It wasn't just him, though. Hacker, you know, the scoreline looks bad, 10 deaths looks bad, but he was really the only player on this team trying to make plays, and I know people are pretty out on Hacker, but I think he's a lot closer to being below average than he is to being like somebody that deserves to be 100% out of the league. Like, there's no upside in Hacker, but he'll have okay games every now and then, and this was all right. Like, he wasn't the worst player on this team. In fact, he was probably the best player on this team in this series. Decade was just literally nothing on the top side. Got outplayed in both lane matchups and then just kind of capitulated towards the back half of the game. Doggo and Jue were nothing. I like Jue a lot as an interesting prospect, but it very much did not, you know, show itself in this first series. I just don't really see a lot of upside in Ultra Prime. This team came in at number 17 for a reason. It's because I would genuinely be surprised if this wasn't a bottom 2, bottom 3 team in the LPL all year long. And this series, I think, already proves that. I don't really love IG as a team. I think they have a lot of holes. I think they have a lot of problems, and Ultra Prime got completely destroyed by them in their first series. I think this is probably indicative of the UP that we're going to be getting for most of the year. And then for IG, nice win, but again, you got to do it against someone that isn't Ultra Prime. I love how this team fought. I thought their macro in this series was really good, and Cryan was just mechanically a genius throughout the entirety of this series, but he's going to have to do that against players that aren't Uakai and Hacker and Decade. That's really what we're going to have to see. Great start for IG, but still a lot left to prove in my opinion. And now moving on to day number 4, and we got to kick day 4 off with a pretty fun matchup between Weibo Gaming and Rare Atom, two teams that, you know, I kind of had different opinions on going into the year. Weibo was ranked higher, but I think generally in terms of consensus, I'm lower on them, having them come in at number 7 in my power rankings, and Rare Atom having jumped up a ton after an amazing Demacia Cup performance against some really good teams. I was really excited to see what they could do. Unfortunately, kind of a tough draw for Rare Atom in their first series of the year, having to go up against Weibo, and Weibo certainly had something to prove here, and they went out and proved it. They won this 2-0, and they were the better team in this series by a pretty considerable margin. This was just a pretty classic Weibo performance. Basically, everybody on the team doing well with the exception of top lane, which is exactly what this team was last year. I know people are sitting here being like, man, ZDZ's not very good. Who is this guy? First of all, if you're saying who is this guy about ZDZ and Xiao Hao, like, are you an LPL fan? Like, these guys have been playing for like 4 years. This isn't like some guy who was new to the league and on a bad team last year. These are two very established players at this level. And yes, they've been on anyone's legend who's like not a good roster, but still, I would be shocked. I'm genuinely surprised at the amount of people that are just like, I've never seen them play. Even if you're just like a top team fan, like they play AL every year. You've seen this guy play at least a couple times a year for 4 years in a row if you're a Weibo fan. And so just very surprised to see people just generally not know who he is, or people generally not know who Xiao Hao is when Xiao Hao was like an all-pro guy for 2 straight years. Like, I don't really understand how Weibo gaming fans work. It did confuse me a bit in that capacity, but you know, I'm going to be honest, like when we're sitting here saying, oh, bot side was really good, you know, jungle was able to get a lot of prio early, and Xiaohu, like Chris, all team fought really well, and top lane was just kind of losing, but we won anyways. Like, that's what Weibo has been, like the past 2 years. That's what Weibo has been with the Shy in the regular season. So I don't really see this team as being all that different from anything it's been over the last couple of years. I think the LPL got stronger at the top, and that's why they fell in my power rankings, but this was a nice win for them. Player of the series is going to go to Crisp for me. Deathless in the first series of the year for Crisp. Not really the reason that he gets player of the series. A lot of it is because of just the amount of plays that he was able to make on the Renata. Those ultimates were genuinely astounding. Really good stuff coming in from him. He continues to be mega underrated by the community as a whole, mostly because he didn't have a great world championship. And again, I understand it. You know, that's what these videos are for, hopefully, to try and inform people who don't regularly watch the LPL or don't regularly watch the LCK. You know, like, who are these players? What can you expect? And why is World sometimes more of an outlier in terms of performances, and why that shouldn't shape your opinion on these players going forward. Crisp was one of the best supports in the world last year. And I was saying that for most of the year. He was the best player on Weibo for most of the year, and then obviously didn't quite perform at Worlds. And so I think the general opinion of Crisp across the internet, across the Western fandom, is that he's not a very good support player. He's overrated. You know, he's kind of fallen off since the FPX days. That couldn't be farther from the truth, and I'm glad to see he continues to prove that here in 2024. I thought Xiao Hao was really good for this team in the jungle. Another really good performance from him. You know, he is as channel darling as the channel darlings come on this channel. I've been singing his praises for so long. I've made him an all-pro on this channel, I think twice. I think in summer of 2023 and in summer of 2022. I think both times I had him third team all-pro in the LPL, not even like just like of the bad teams, like genuinely one of the 3 best junglers in the LPL. I think we're going to see this being a major upgrade over Weiwei as the season continues to progress, and I think this was a good start. Xiaohu was really good, was definitely the better mid laner out of him and Vikla in this, which is a very good sign, and Light continues to just capitalize on everything that everybody on this team does. Not the most aggressive ADC in the world, but again, he doesn't have to be. He has great playmakers around him. Really good stuff coming in from the bot side of the map. Again, ZDZ did lose in both games on the top side, especially in that game number 1 on the Udyr, where he very narrowly cost his team the entire game, but ZDZ was always going to be the question mark for this team, and it's not like the Shy didn't lose, you know, a handful of games for Weibo last year. It's just kind of what happens on the top side for Weibo, and while ZDZ is definitely not going to give you the upside that the Shy gives you, I think their downsides are going to be relatively similar. Either way, nice win for Weibo. Definitely good to see after they, in my opinion, underperformed at that Demacia Cup tournament. You didn't want to see them lose to NIP, and they lost anyway, so really nice to see them get their groove back here in this series. But for Rare Atom, it was kind of the opposite. They were amazing in Demacia Cup, and I think that's where I want to start. I see a lot of people talking about how this team isn't very talented, how this is again going to be a bottom tier team in the LPL, how Xiaoshu is mega stuck, how this is going to be, you know, elo hell for Xiaoshu. I think those people, again, I hate to use the word, but they're overreacting. They are once again overreacting to 1 series, 2 games. We have seen more good out of this 5 for Rare Atom than we've seen bad. And again, I know a lot of people say like, oh, Demacia Cup is a preseason tournament, no one cares. Every team had their starting lineup in, with the exception really of JD Gaming, who really were only missing their jungler. I mean, Sheer is obviously not the main starter for that team, but they count him as like he is a starting member of that team. He's their 6th man, and so you can kind of consider him there. It was just no Kanavi. You still had Yagao, you still had Ruler, you still had Missing, so it's not like that team was really a problem. And Rare Atom like beat LNG. So this team has shown that they can do some things. It just didn't happen here on today. Dead of the series is going to go to Vikla. I'm going to be honest. honest, he was not very good in this series. But again, you want to talk about the first thing we saw out of Vikla in Demacia Cup? It was him mega stomping Scout. Like, it was him just absolutely gapping Scout. And so I know Vikla doesn't look good here, but all the comments about how Vikla's washed and how obviously he was going to come in and be one of the worst mid laners in the region, let's pump the brakes a second. Xiaohu's a pretty good player, and Vikla's really kind of been 50-50 if you take Demacia Cup into account on good and bad. I'm really not super concerned about Vikla. If we're looking back in 2 weeks once this team gets an easier schedule, being like Vikla's mega stomping the bad mid laners of this region, you know, Nayu I think is a really fun player to watch and even had some good moments in here. Like, I think they're as good to rare Adam. I think this was just a tough start to the season, and I'm not going to freak out over it. Vikla, like I said, was gapped and was a bit of a problem in this series, but he is a bit of a feast or famine player. Like, he's always been more volatile than people give him credit for, and so, you know, the bad performances are going to happen. You just hope that the good performances come alongside them. And honestly, I think they probably will. I'm not freaking out. Xiaoshu was very good for this team, and he was definitely the best player on this team in this series. But I'm not going to sit here and say that he's elo held on a team that I think could have a very good jungle mid duo, could have a serviceable bot lane. They weren't very good in this series. Light and Crisp were certainly more active, and Lucian Nami doesn't look particularly strong. First of all, Zora is also in instead of Xiaoxi. That's fine. I mean, neither are game breakers. I think Xiaoxi's probably a better player, but, you know, this organization has always liked Zora ever since he came up as a prospect through their system. So if you want to start him, then sure, whatever. Prove to me that that's the right decision. But Xiaoshu is not, you know, maybe he ends up being elo held, but I don't think it's a fair claim to say that he is this early on into the season. So I want to refute that. I think Xiaoshu is obviously a very good player. He gapped ZDZ in lane, but, you know, we'll see what happens with Nayu and Vikla. It didn't end up working out here against a good Weibo Gaming team, but I think it's something that could work out against worse teams as the split goes on. And this, you know, very well could be a playoff team. Like, I ranked them number 11 for a reason, is because, you know, maybe Weibo Gaming's a little bit out of their reach, but, you know, are we saying that OMG and WE and Edward Gaming are teams that are definitely better than Rare Adam even after this bad performance? I certainly can't say so. They almost won game 1 off the back of their top laner being good basically by themselves. This is a team that can win games, and so I'm interested in seeing what can happen here. Not a great perfect first showing for them, especially for Vikla, but again, I expect it to get better. And then for Weibo, this was a good showing. I think you would have wanted to see game 1 be a little bit cleaner, but this team has never been the cleanest team in the world, and the fact that they're beating Rare Adam already shows that this is an improved roster in terms of consistency. ZDZ is definitely going to need to step up if they want to compete for anything near a top 4 spot, but I really like the bottom side of this map, and, you know, they were world finalists for a reason. This team is going to be interesting to watch all year. Then moving on to our second series of day 4, and this is one of the bigger upsets of the week entirely here. It was LNG taking on ThunderTalk Gaming, and ThunderTalk picking up a strong first win of the season. LNG, you know, I'm not going to hit the panic button just yet, but honestly, I'm a little bit closer to hitting it than maybe I am with some other teams. This team has yet to win a series this year, and that includes Demacia Cup after getting beat by Rare Adam. They got beat by Rare Adam, now they get beat by ThunderTalk. I don't know, man. This team is going to be a little bit concerning. You know, there are reasons to believe that, oh, it's the start of the split. This has always been a group of players, especially players like Scout, that have been a little bit slower to pick up new metas and a little bit slower to pick up new techs, but is the meta really all that different than it was last year, especially in the mid lane? I don't know, and ThunderTalk just kind of outplayed him, especially in the back half of this series, so, you know, really good on ThunderTalk, and I think this team is going to be pretty fun to watch, and obviously we'll talk about it, but LNG is a bit concerning at this point. Let's get right into it, though, starting with ThunderTalk. Player of the series, you know, it was kind of tough because both of their carry roles were so phenomenal in this series, but I'm going to give it to UCal in the mid lane. I think generally UCal is the guy. He is the dude, if you will, on this ThunderTalk team. We'll talk about 1XN in a second, who had a really awesome series. Talk about, you know, kind of a make or break performance from a really young prospect that they're putting a lot of hype and potential into, a lot of resources into. He really paid them back out in this series, but UCal is the guy, and it becomes a lot harder to win series like this if you don't have a player of UCal's caliber in the mid lane. He is just so spectacular, so fun to watch, such a good player. Talk about a career resurgence. He's come over here to ThunderTalk and to the LPL, and he's genuinely become one of the best mid laners in the world because of it. So really happy to see that going into Scout, being able to win pretty handily, especially in that game number 3 on the Tristana. Really good stuff coming in from him. He was obviously great on the Azir in game number 1. Just awesome stuff. UCal has been a dominant mid laner at this level for over a year now, and at this point, it's no longer a surprise to see him show up like this against a team like LNG. But it is for 1XN and Chocho, who I thought were awesome in the bot lane here. Gala and Mark Mark, you were interested to see what was going to happen out of the two of them. You were hoping that this was going to create a much more aggressive bot lane environment for LNG, something that they can play through a lot more actively in the isolated 2v2. I think that was the idea of bringing Mark on here. That's something that he individually specializes in as a player, but man, 1xN and Chocho were awesome here. Chocho's mechanics were super impressive on the Nami. He was really adept at being able to set the rest of his team up. It wasn't even just the Lucian. Obviously, it's great on the Lucian, but he was exactly where he needed to be at all times. This was a really great performance from Chocho, and 1xN was an amazing carry in this series. We've been talking about some ADCs where it's like, they were in the right spot at the right time. They capitalized on the other players on their team, making good situations for them, but no, 1xN was creating those good situations, especially in the mid game for ThunderTalk. Great late game team fighting from him. Bottom 3 here, phenomenal. I thought Hoya was all right in the top side, and Beishuan, to his credit, he made some mistakes, especially in the middle of this series on the Maokai. Was really, really important towards the back of the series. That objective steal in the back half of game number 3 was game winning for ThunderTalk. I mean, truly it was, defining. And obviously, this is something I'm going to rant about in a much shorter section than I am a lot of other, things. We're seeing so many people comment things like, if only Zhao Huanggren was starting in here for Beishuan. I just want to remind people, because I know people don't watch the LDL, Zhao Huanggren has been a below average jungler in the LDL for the past year. Not gonna say anything else. Maybe it's the mental toll is taking its toll on Zhao Huanggren. Maybe, but all I'm gonna remind people is that from a pure performance perspective, Zhao Huanggren has not been a very good LDL jungler over the past year. His flaws have been exploited by players that are significantly worse than the ones that we're seeing in the LPL. That being said, I understand that Beishuan could probably be a little bit better in series like this, but he's always been somebody that's a bit more there for the macro than he is for the mechanics, and I still think that the macro was really good. ThunderTalk just out macroed LNG in this series. He's a great shot caller, and I think we continued to see that. Overall, ThunderTalk, I think, was really strong, really solid in this series. I think Yucal, 1xN, and Chocho were definitely the standouts and definitely who you're going to hang your hat on in a good way, but, it's going to be interesting to see how LNG bounces back, because, again, this is not the start to the split that you were looking for, especially after a very underwhelming Demacia Cup. This is really not a good look. Weiwei is in here for Tarzan. Mark is in here for Hong. Those both kind of look like downgrades, at least so far. Mark really did not look good in this series on any of the enchanters. It's really not his playstyle. He's definitely much more of an engager player, and I know we're in enchanter meta, but you can still play Nautilus. You can still play, champions of that vein. Rel is certainly something you could have flexed into the support position. I really don't know about putting him on Milio and Nami and Renata every single game. It was certainly a choice, but for me, dud of the series was pretty easy. It's going to go to Scout in the mid lane. Talk about a shocking development here. The double MVP from last year, the two-time MVP in both spring and summer in the LPL, one of the best players in the entire world last year. Starts off 2024 a little bit, tumultuously, I guess we will say. Got outplayed by Yucal in the series. There really is no other way to put it. That Nico game in game 3 was genuinely bad. Like, it was not a very good game. Scout, like I said earlier, has always been a bit slower at adapting to the meta than a lot of the other mid laners in the LPL. It's been kind of a hindrance of his in the past, but, you gotta see him do it soon. He was pretty quick last year, and, this team really didn't make that many changes, so for Scout to come out and just kind of get outplayed by Yucal in Series 1, it's certainly something to be at least a little bit cognizant of, but I'm not gonna freak out. Again, it's 3 games. I've said this over the course of this series, or this video so far. I'm never going to sit here and say 3 games is how I'm going to define an entire team. It's just not how it works. It is really hard to get a good idea of how a team plays in one series, but it is worth noting that Scout wasn't good. Zika was solid. I thought Gala did okay. He was good in the game they won on the Lucian, but he could have done a lot more, I think, towards the back half of game number 3. Weiwei was just not very good in this series. There are concerns about LNG. I think their macro is definitely a little lackluster at the moment, and it's going to be interesting to see if that continues. Weiwei has always been a little bit less on that end than maybe a player like Tarzan was in terms of shot calling and macro, and we'll see what happens with Mark. It's going to be interesting, but right now I am a bit worried about LNG. I still think they could be one of the better teams in the entire world if everything goes right. Just not the start they were looking for, but it definitely is for ThunderTalk. Great win from them. Basically everything you could have asked for. Yucal, 1xN, and Chocho in particular looking great. If those 3 can continue to be upper echelon players in their roles as we go throughout the year, I mean, who's to say ThunderTalk can't be like a middle tier playoff team at their absolute best? And now we get to move on to day number 5, and as you know, the final 3 days of the week here are triple headers, if you will. We used to get 2 series every single day in the LPL. Now we get 3 towards the back half of the week in the weekend here. So kicking off our first of the big 3 days here on day 5, it was Anyone's Legend taking on Team WE And WE is going to pick up the win here. Again, don't panic about WE. I saw so many people in the first, day, the first games that WE played all year being like, well, this team's going to suck. They're the rogue of the LPL. They're going to get last place. They're going to be completely unviable. Prince and Fofo were wasted signings. Wayward sucks. Worst top laner in the league. Yada, yada, yada. Give it time. They're fine. AL is a good team, and WE came out and were just able to beat them. This was something that I was pretty confident was going to be the case once they started getting their shit together, because the worry with this team was that they would be too aggressive, not the fact that they would be too passive like they were in their first series. So this was a lot more of, I think, what we were expecting from this team going into the year from a playstyle perspective. And then for AL, some good and some bad. I think they had an opportunity to win Game 2 here. There were moments where they looked pretty okay, and generally I think the talent was just better in Game 2, but Game 1 was so bad from them that it put them in such a hole, and you don't want to get that far behind against a team like WE. It's just going to be really hard to get back out of a situation like that, so unfortunate for them, but player of the series for me is pretty obviously going to go to Wayward in this one. What a dominant performance from Wayward. I've been telling y'all to chill about Wayward, the player I've compared him to the most, and this, I haven't gotten any pushback on this, which I honestly thought I would. I've compared him to Morgan. I think they're very similar players. I think they have very similar play styles, and I think they have very similar career arcs. I think Morgan started on that Hanwha Life team and was just overmatched with the amount of options he was given in the LCK. He got to play with players like Chovy and Deft super early on in his career, and he just was the weak link of that team, and he was always scapegoated for their negatives, and Wayward was basically identical on top esports. Both of them are good players, but maybe just players that shouldn't be on top 2, top 3 teams in the region, or top 5 teams in the world like they both were asked to do for a really long time. But Wayward, like I said, won a lot more than he lost over the course of his career. It's just that his losses were a lot more recognizable. This is the kind of performance that Wayward is capable of giving when he is given resources. He's just never really had resources over the course of his entire career. It's really fun to watch him really break out in a series like this against a player that everybody is in love with the exception of me. I thought I was, I'm a lot lower on Harry. I still think he can be a really interesting player, but he's very one-dimensional at this current moment in time, and Wayward absolutely took advantage of that. So credit to Wayward. Really happy to see him have 2 good games of K'Sante. Now, it is K'Sante. That champion is stupid and ridiculous, but he was the best player in this series, and it wasn't really all that debatable. You can look at Prince, who had a phenomenal Game 1 on the Misfortune. I'm certainly not going to try to take that away from him, but a lot of that Game 1 was created by someone else. It was Rel engages, it was Bard engages, it was K'Sante setups, and all of that coming to say that, Prince he did his job. He played Misfortune, he was able to press R, and he got a bunch of kills because of it. So credit to Prince, but Wayward was the star of this series, and I really don't even think that's all that up for debate. Awandi was also really good here. Him and Prince, I think, are developing a nice chemistry. Awandi tends to do that. Chemistry is kind of a strength of his. He always tends to play however his ADC needs him to play. He's very flexible as a player. Can sometimes be a little bit low impact because of that. He kind of relies on his ADC to create a lot, but it was really nice to see him kind of take the reins in, game number 1 here on the Bard, where he really dominated. And then Game 2 was all Wayward. It was all the K'Sante perma engaging and just kind of dominating. They didn't have nearly as big of a lead in the mid lane in Game 2, which is why they relied a lot more on the top side of the map. They also had a Dr. Mundo in the jungle, which is ridiculous, but, generally I think WE was a lot better in this series. Basically everybody won in both games, with the exception of Shanks having a much better game in Game number 2, but we'll get to him in a second. Generally, I think WE was better in this series, and this is why I told people not to panic for games exactly like this. And then for AL on the other side, again, I don't want to freak out about this. Really, this was one bad game and another where you just kind of lost down the stretch, where you just didn't have the same kind of firepower as the team that you were going up against, where Wayward in the top side was the best player on the Rift, and you just kind of had to deal with that. But game number 1 was pretty bad, and most of it came from Shanks in the mid lane. He's not going to get my dead of the game, or my dead of the series, because he was the best player on AL. He really kept game 2 alive on the Tristana, but his game 1 on the Orianna was genuinely miserable. It's one of the worst games that we've seen in the LPL this split. I like Shanks, but this was not the kind of reunion, I think, with his old org that he really was expecting to have. Fofo outclassed him a lot in game number 1 on the Trist. My dead of the series is going to go to Harry on the top side. He really just kind of got outclassed in lane against Wayward, and that doesn't happen super often to Harry. I called him a pretty one-dimensional player, and that dimension is laning phase. He's a very good laner. He's very good at being able to generate leads. The problem is that he genuinely has no idea what to do from there. He had no idea last year, and honestly, through the beginning part of this split, he struggled with that as well. He's not been getting leads as consistently. It's only been 2 series. I'm not going to freak out about it, but, I was lower on Harry going into the split. There were a lot of things that I thought thought he had to work on. Top lane is it's important for you to be able to get your own leads in top lane, but it's significantly more important what you do with those leads in top lane than it is like your laning stats. And I think that's always going to be what holds Harry back unless he gets better at that stage of the game. So he wasn't very good here. Like I said, Shanks was awful in game one. I don't think Kale did particularly well, playing a couple of different picks that were not in the recon, but Krako kind of got out jungled. Hang had pressure maybe outside of game two where the Dr. Mundo was just kind of there. Overall, I don't think AL played bad. I want to stress that I really don't think this was a schlacking. I think Shanks kind of had a bad game one and Harry wasn't really all that up for it, and that was enough for WE to be able to capitalize with their really good macro. I think that was just it. I'm not freaking out about AL. This is a loss they should take, and this is a win that WE should also have. I think that this was honestly even better than I could have expected from their first win of the season. You would have hoped it came in the series prior, but for Wayward to play so well, for Prince and Awandi to look so good, and for Hang to play really well on the Rel, and for Fofo to look good on Tristana, it's a really good sign. I think this team is still going to be fine. All the people who, spoke about their death after seeing them play 2 games, I hope this is enough to calm you down. All right, and moving on to our second series of day 5, and similarly to our first, it's an 0-2 team beating a 2-0 team. It's OMG taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and FPX is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. Really nice stuff from FPX. I think OMG is maybe a little bit in kind of a flux position right now where they kind of feel like gatekeepers of, the good section of the league, but FPX really struggled in their first series. They made one pretty drastic change here, but generally this team just looked a lot more coordinated and a lot better here in the second series. A lot of mistakes coming in from OMG that FPX did a good job to capitalize on. These games weren't perfect from either of these teams, but definitely were better from FPX. I think that they definitely looked like a lot more of a competent team here the second time around in week number 1. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me, pretty obviously, is going to go to Dectum in the bot lane here. Awesome stuff coming in from Dectum. Really high on him as a player. I always have been. I remember thinking back to his time on Team Dynamics, before they became Nongshim, and I'm like, man, this guy's like secretly really good. He's really fun to watch. His mechanics are very good. He's just not aggressive enough for me to consider him like the greatest prospect I've ever seen, but he got a shot in the LCK, was put on a pretty good Nongshim team, had talent around him like Peanut, like Rich, like Gory, players that we've talked about in other regions. And things worked out. They were good enough. They barely missed out on Worlds. He gets brought up to Damwon, and it's like, oh, is he the weak link of Damwon? He was never the weak link of Damwon. He was always the most consistent member of that team. Even when a lot of the other members were just struggling or making bad plays, he was always there in the late game to kind of keep things fine. For DRX, obviously, everything was just a disaster last year. He gets hurt. He gets sent down to Challengers, dominates Challengers, gets another shot here in the LPL. And look at him. He's awesome here. His Aphelios is amazing. It always has been. It's been his signature champion his entire career, and it's really good to see that continue, but Zeri is nowhere near a relevant champion on this patch that they are playing on. It doesn't matter, though. Dectum is so good at this style of playing hyper carries, not really overextending in the early game, and being given enough resources to just insta-win every team fight. That's what Dectum does at a really high level, and it's good to see that that's something that this team can continuously rely on from him, because honestly, he looked amazing in this game. I was really happy to see the mechanical prowess that he was able to show off. Even Life, his bot lane partner that everybody has criticized, me included, that has not played well over the past year or so, looked great on Enchanters, just enabling someone like Dectum to be able to carry the game. So perhaps that's a style FPX could lean into more. Again, think back to the thread and the social media comments that were surrounding FPX in the first series. Oh, why would they import, third-rate Korean imports like Dectum and Life? Well, here is a win over OMG thanks to Dectum. I really want to make that point clear. You can't judge a team by 2 games. In the same way that I'm not judging FPX right now, saying that they're going to be good by the fact that Dectum played well here. It's good to see it, but again, it's only been 4 games. Week 1 was up and down, but at least there was an up. Zhao Lahu was also really good in this series. I talked about it a lot last year. I thought it was the most impressive he had ever played in the summer split. There were actually periods of time where he was just consistently winning lane, and not only doing that, but translating it into relevant active leads across the map, which I think the best top laners in the world are able to do. He's been given so many chances on this organization as a top lane prospect that's supposed to break through, and he just never lived up to it. I think he's kind of settled into this spot where he's a good top laner. I don't think he's an elite top laner. I don't think he'll ever get to that spot, but I think he's somebody that can win you games every once in a while, like he did here in game number 2 on the Cassante. Good stuff. Even the Gnar in game 1 I thought was really solid. So, props to FPX, props to Zhao Lahu for sticking with him for so long, because he has finally, I think, hit a point where he is a relevant LPL starter. The only other thing to talk about with FPX here is Milky Way. He played the entire series. I am very intrigued by this. I always said that Milky Way was a more interesting jungle prospect to me than Moyen, even though Moyen was on the better team in the LDL. Milky Way is a very fun player to see watch. Now, there were some communication errors. I don't know how much time he's had to practice with the rest of this team. I think if he continues to stay in this lineup, things will get better, but for now, it's something to monitor. Either way, really nice series from FPX and a pretty bad series from OMG. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm all that surprised. I'm a bit lower on this OMG roster just because I don't really see a lot of upside out of Starry, and unfortunately that came into fruition in this series. Starry was kind of bad. He's going to get my dud of the series. The mechanics are just a little concerning. He picks Lucian, he picks Xayah. These are champions that need to be able to accelerate the game super quickly. Obviously, Xayah can scale into the late game, but not so much against a Zeri. You're not really going to want to take that scaling matchup, especially look at the rest of this team comp. You've got a Xin Zhao. You're going up against an Azir Maokai. It's just not an easy matchup for you to be able to win if you play super passive. So Starry felt like he had to do a lot, and I just don't know if he's skilled enough to actually be able to do that against a team like FPX. I think he really let his team down here. I don't think PP God was particularly good either. I want to make that abundantly clear. It very much feels like Abel should be in here, and I don't really know what they're doing. Abel feels like a pretty easy fix to this situation. It just doesn't feel like Starry is ready for a spot like this, and you've got, a top 5-ish AD carry on your roster in the organization. This feels very similar to what happened last year when 1xN came in for Huanfeng. Now, 1xN turned out to be a lot better, I think, than people expected him to be, but I don't know. For a team like OMG, I think at least at the start of the year, you got to see what this team looks like with your good players before you sub them out. Like I said, PP God wasn't very good. Cube got kind of demolished in the top lane matchup by Zhao Laohu. Cube was just not as good here. We talked about Cube kind of overperforming in the first series. He's been on the downward trajectory for the past year or so. I think that is likely to continue this year. Zhao Feng continues to impress me with his aggressiveness. I think that he is certainly someone to watch because he's not afraid to go for plays in the early game. Kind of reminds me a lot of what we talked about with Hang, the WE jungler, in his rookie year last year, where he's really just not afraid to try and make those plays in the early game. I think you can teach and coach and get some experience on a lot of the other things, but mentality-wise, I feel like he's actually a very interesting player. He has already exceeded my expectations quite a lot, and then Angel was just kind of there on Corki and Orianna, didn't really have a lot of prio to do a whole ton. So for OMG, again, it's a loss, but you're 2-2 on the week, you're 1-1 in terms of series score. You're not going to freak out or anything. I just don't know what the upside of this team is, especially if the bot lane is going to play like this. But for FPX, it's a nice win. Does this accelerate them into the top 11, 12 teams? I don't really know yet. This is a very weird, week one, I think, in general. This is an upset, but not a really shocking one. So, I'm going to have to consider some things. I'm still concerned about, can Life sustain it? Can Milky Way, clean up some of the communication mistakes? Is Zhao Laohu going to be good every game? Like, there are definitely some question marks about this team, but at the same time, it is good to see that they are capable of winning if the circumstance is right. And then moving on to the third series of day 5 here, and this was a good one. When top 5 teams go head-to-head, it's always fun. It was Bilibili Gaming taking on Royal Never Give Up. And Bilibili's going to take it 2-0. This isn't particularly surprising or shocking to anybody who is really familiar with the LPL. Bilibili looks pretty unstoppable at the current moment in RNG. Even though they are a top 5 team, they're certainly the most dubious of the top 5 teams. We saw them earlier in the week against Edward Gaming. They really weren't all that good in that matchup. But man, the concerns for RNG are very much present. This was not a good showing. This was not a team that was remotely in this series. They got mega gapped mechanically, macro-wise. It just was not close. This was kind of a destruction coming in from BLG, which is definitely what you want to see from them. So let's talk about it. Player of the series, come on, man. It's Knight. Are you kidding me? I know it. I get it. It looks like I'm a fanboy. I understand why I get that reputation sometimes, but when you watch the LPL every single game and you see people try to play into Knight's Akali and you see them just not be able to play, just they have absolutely no way to play the game, you sit there and you go, this is the best player in the world. Like, it's just hard to think anything else. He is so good, and I think the scary part for the LPL is he genuinely feels pretty pissed off right now. I think he took getting, replaced by Yagao on JD Gaming very personally, and I think he's kind of on a revenge tour right now, and to be on a revenge tour with this team, with Elk and On in the bot lane, with Bin and June as your top side, if you're the best player in the world on a revenge tour in the mid lane for that team, oh my god. Like, that's got to be the scariest thing in the world to have to play into. Knight was spectacular in this game. He has been spectacular all of week 1. Who knows if it's going to last like this the entire split, but at least for now, it's ridiculous. This was an easy choice for player of the series. I mean, it was mostly the Akali, but the Nico game was also ridiculous. He makes Azirs that play into him look completely incompetent. It was Cream at first. Tong Yuan looked even worse in this series. It just looked completely outclassed. Knight is just on a different level from basically every other LPL mid laner, and that's kind of what we're realizing over the course of the beginning part of this year. Hopefully he can keep this up. But Elk and On were spectacular in this series. Elk in particular looked amazing on both the Lucian and the Senna. Elk is awesome. He's so aggressive. And to play with a mid laner who's super aggro, a jungler who's super aggro, a top laner who's super aggro, a support who's super aggro, it's just a super fun experience to watch a team that's this aggressive and this proactive go out there with the mechanics that they have and just kind of dominate in the way that they did against a team that is not proactive, that will just let themselves lose the game. Really fun stuff. Elk and On continue to look amazing. Very high quality players, obviously, but, you know, they're playing like it. Bin and June, you know, June looked good. He definitely out-jungled Wei, especially in game number 2, playing Lee Sin into Brand. Take back what I said about Brand earlier. Not every single Brand game looks good. We'll talk about Wei in a second, but Bin was really the only one where it's like, maybe you should pick something else into Rumble. Maybe that wasn't the call in this particular instance. Not that I think he got like mega gapped or played historically awful or anything like that, but Breathe was really the only player on RNG actually doing anything in this series, and I think Bin was a bit, you know, behind the 8 ball on that. But again, it's 2 games of Rumble. Like, I'm willing to give Bin the benefit of the doubt. Rumble's a hard champion to counter in pro. A lot of the solo queue counters just don't really work in a team environment as well, or at least that's what I would imagine was going through their head. But generally, this bot side is so good that it almost doesn't matter what happens anywhere else on the map. They're going to win hard enough for you to be able to win. And when you're saying that about a team that has Bin and June on the top side, I mean, it's legit over. Like, BLG is ridiculous. And then for RNG, this is not an I told you so, because I saved my I told you so's for more than a couple of games into a split. But we're on the precipice of an I told you so about LWX, and, you know, we're going to see how it ends up playing out, but this is what I was worried about. This is the LWX that's been on FPX the past couple of years. This guy who just kind of sits there and slowly loses. Like, no proactivity, no aggression, no thought behind those eyes, just a player who absolutely does not want to try and take any risks, and that's kind of what he was in this series. He's going to get dud of the series for it. I think people are going to start noticing, because he's on a good team, a tad bit more than when he was on FPX when that team was losing. I think a lot of people associated him with, you know, a lot of their wins, and so they didn't necessarily see him as part of the problem. I think a lot of the flaws that he has in his game are probably going to get exposed as we go throughout more of this year. I did receive a bit of flack in my primer and in my offseason grades video for putting LWX so low. This is the LWX I've been watching for the past year and a half. It's going to be interesting to see if it sticks. I don't know how realistic it is for this to be the version that they get of him every single game, because Ming was like historically bad in this series. This is one of the worst series I've ever seen Ming play, but I think a lot of that was him just trying to do things when, you know, his ADC is just not following up on it. It felt like a lot of miscommunications coming in from RNG, a lot of anti-proactivity, a lot of passiveness coming in from this bot lane. I think Wei was also really bad in the jungle. The Brand, like I said, did not work. The Vi did not work. June was definitely out jungling Wei in this series. It's something that's become pretty common for Wei, is being good against the bad players and bad against the good players over the past year or so. Not good to see that keep up. Tong Yuan got mega outclassed by Knight. And like I said, Breathe was trying to do stuff on the top side. He is the best player on this team. You know, I would have hoped it would have been Ming, but right now it is definitely Breathe in the top lane. And if that's the case, you're not shocked. Breathe's a very good player, but, you know, I don't know if RNG's a top 5 team. They barely beat EDG. They got blown back by Bilibili Gaming. This is a team that I am concerned about. Again, I'm not hitting the panic button. I'm not hitting the I told you so button on RNG just yet, because it's only been 5 games. It's only 5 games, and that's really a very small sample size. But I do want to say that so far, my fears have been a bit confirmed. This team is very slow. They don't really seem to have an identity, and that concerns me moving forward. And then for Bilibili, the opposite. There's a reason I put this team at number 1. They're the most mechanically talented team in the world if everything goes right, and right now, everything is going right. Knight looks terrifying to play into. Elk and On look like they are the best bot lane in the LPL. You know, we'll see what happens when JDG starts playing, but for now, at least they look great. You know, June has been really strong in the jungle, and it's been on the top side, who I think is the best top laner in the world. Maybe Zeus, right? Like, that's your competition. Bilibili's amazing. They are one of the scariest teams in the entire world, and they continuously prove it. And now moving on to day number 6, the beginning of our weekend here, and we kicked it off with what I'm sure is a super fun, super close, super competitive series that certainly wasn't a blowout by any means. Invictus Gaming taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas. Oh wait, this was not that. This was not close. This was not a very fun series. I mean, it was fun if you're an NIP fan. If you're a Ninjas in Pyjamas fan, you're like, oh my god, we're 4-0, and we just mega stomped Invictus Gaming. We're awesome. We're untouchable. If you're Invictus Gaming, you're like, I don't remember this series. I remember us beating Ultra Prime, and then that was the end of week number 1. But oh my god, like, what do I even say about this series? This was a mega stomp. I mean, both games were under 30 minutes, but truthfully, both games were under 10 minutes in terms of of the actual impact that things had. It didn't really matter what anybody was playing champion-wise. It didn't really matter what anybody was doing on the map. It was just gap after gap after gap. I can't remember a 2-game series that was as dominant as this one in a long time. I mean, this was about as not close as it possibly gets. This was a demolition coming in from the side of Ninjas in Pyjamas. So congratulations to them. We can talk about it very quick. Player of the series, come on. I mean, who is it? It's Rookie. I mean, Jesus. You know, it's been a little while since we saw Rookie really come out and perform like this, but, you know, I'm glad to see it. I'm really glad to see him go back to the organization that he himself chose to go back to, getting to play with some of the players that he himself chose to play with, and really proving that that was the right decision. 18-0 and 21 in 2 games on Corki and Azir. Controlled the early game. I've never seen a Corki dominate a Nico in lane as fast as Rookie was able to do to Cryan, and the Azir was everywhere. I mean, just everywhere on the map, constantly dealing damage, constantly taking over. What a performance from Rookie. For all the people who were saying that he was completely washed, I mean, there were moments last year where I was starting to believe it because he wasn't really all that good on top esports. It really felt like we were starting to get that downward slope on Rookie's career, but lo and behold, he just needed an environment where he could go and feel a lot more comfortable because this is peak Rookie, and I mean that in the most clear sense. This is one of the best performances we've seen out of him in a really long time in a 2-game stretch. Photic was also awesome in this series. I know I'm kind of the resident Photic hater, and I kind of have been, you know, for the past 2 years, even going back to 2022 Victory 5. I've been the resident Photic hater for a little while, but I gotta acknowledge when the dude plays fantastic, and he just was really good in these 2 games. His positioning was really good. His mental was really good. That's something I've always been a bit concerned with him by, is he got tilted a bit quicker than I think a lot of other AD carries in his role. He would try to make plays a little bit more aggressively than other people would in his positions. I talked about the first series where he just kind of was a passenger. Not at all in this series. The Senna, the Xayah, they were both really good from him. Zhuo was also really good on both the TK and the Rakan, but Rookie, Photic, Zhuo dominated. Shanji dominated the top side. Wasn't quite as dominant in the laning phase. There were some actual good moments from You Should Know Me on the other side. Certainly the only glimpse of hope from IG in this series, but Shanji was awesome in the team fights on K'Sante. Shanji strikes again. And Aki continues to be one of, if not the most consistent jungler in the LPL, full stop. This guy does not get the recognition he deserves, but truthfully, this series is all about Rookie. It's kind of about Photic, but it's mostly about Rookie with just how good he was in these 2 games. And then for IG on the other side, I mean, you gotta take this one and just roll with the punches, right? You live to fight another day. Luckily for you, this only counts as 1 series loss on your resume, even though this probably feels like 10 series loss in terms of just how hard you got beat. You Should Know Me had some moments in laning phase where it was like, oh, okay, this guy can play Jack. Shanji's really good at K'Sante. It's really nice to see him take these really good trades and actively be able to create some advantages on the top side on his own. And that's about the extent of the good things I can say about IG in this series. They tried to swap out their bot laner midway through. Xiao Yueji was so poor in game number 1 that they were like, well, I guess we have to put On back in now because, you know, we just got to see what he is. And that didn't fix anything. They made Wink play Lissandra in game 2, and that certainly didn't solve a lot of the problems that they ended up having. I've not seen a mid laner get gapped like this in quite a long time. Cryan is a very easy choice for dud of the series. Rookie was dominating early games on Corki and Azir into Nico and Orianna. It's just not acceptable. It's not a good thing to allow to happen if you're IG. Cryan, coming off of what was a really good series against his former org in Ultra Prime, now just gets utterly dumpstered by Rookie, and it's not a particularly good thing to see. Tianjin locking in Nocturne in game 1 into Maokai, Corki, Senna, Tom Kench, even K'Sante. Like, what are you supposed to do here, man? Like, who are you supposed to stick on to? Because I have no idea. I have no idea what the point of that thing was. The Rel in game 2 was just as bad, but the Nocturne is just completely baffling to me in terms of the draft pick that you end up going for in general. IG just was not here today. We did not get an Invictus Gaming performance on today's day. On day 6, it just wasn't there. You're going to hope that they can bury this behind them and move on because this was a heartbreaking loss, and you know, you're just going to have to hope that they're going to be better moving forward. But for NIP, this team is legit. I think we're at the point where I can say that this team is pretty darn good. I moved them up after Demacia Cup because their top side was so good in that tournament. If you're getting good performances out of Photic and Zhuo, this could be a Worlds team easy right now already. Like, that was the only thing that I think could possibly hold them back, was can Rookie even, you know, be the superstar that he was? We knew he was going to be good, but was he going to be real good? Yes. Can Photic and Zhuo just survive on the bot side? So far, they've done more than that in their first 2 series, and so right now I'm feeling really good about Ninjas in Pyjamas. This actually feels like one of the strongest teams in the LPL. Now moving on to our second series of day number 6, and we're honestly blessed to get this series so early. It's a battle of the bottom teams. It's LGD Gaming taking on Ultra Prime. And LGD Gaming is going to pick up the 2-1 series win in this one. They're going to take the final 2 games after, honestly, they probably should have taken the first one as well. They definitely were the better team in this series. I think that was very clear from, especially game 2 onwards, but even really from the start of game 1 onwards. It was, Ultra Prime's resilience, I guess you can say, in game number 1 that ended up getting them that comeback win. Hacker and Uakai in particular looking good. Decade had a couple of really nice team fights, but at the end of the day, LGD is a better team than Ultra Prime is, and that's really sad to say, because LGD is not a particularly good team, but the truth is that the top side of the map is at the very least competent for LGD, even if they probably have the worst bot lane in the LPL, and Ultra Prime just has a bunch of players that are I don't know. This is probably the worst team in the LPL. I would be shocked if that doesn't come to fruition, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Bertle in the top lane. Again, this is not an I told you so moment. I think anybody who had watched Bertle knew that he was probably going to be better than the team that was around him on this LGD team. He's been really good in lane for the past, 4 years in terms of the opportunities that he's got, whether that's on Damwon or whether that was on Sandbox. The problem was that he would make some pretty egregious errors in terms of lapses of judgment in the mid game on Sandbox last split, which is why he ended up getting replaced by Clear in that starting lineup. I've always liked Bertle. I always thought he was better than he got credit for. I think that he has a ton of mechanical potential, which is why I ranked him in my top 10 top laners in the LPL at the current moment. I thought that he was somebody that would actually be able to compete if he was on a better team, but probably not on this one, and we continue to see that as laning continues to be a really big positive. Decade really struggled trying to match him at all in lane throughout this series. That's kind of always been Decade's problem, but Bertle made it abundantly clear in the final 2 games that laning was just something that was going to be in LGD's favor. I think Haichao continues to impress me. This might be the best start to a split that he's ever had. I've never really been all that blown back by Haichao, but he's actually been really good to start this year, kind of quietly very good, and quietly maybe the best player on this team. He definitely had some moments in games 2 and 3, specifically game 3 on the Nico, where he actually looked really solid. Really happy to see him continue his development. He, kind of similar to Zhao Laohu for FPX, felt like a player who had been given a ton of opportunities and never really made it worthwhile to have those opportunities, but he finally is starting to get some confidence under his belt, and I think it's starting to show at least a little bit in terms of his gameplay. People like Meteor, I don't think Meteor was actually all that good in this series. I think, obviously his game 1 damage was solid, and they probably should have won that game 1 off of the brand alone, but they weren't able to do that. Unfortunately, a lot of the reason they lost was Hacker kind of outplaying him towards the back half in terms of the macro and the decision-making that he had. But, he was fine. I still think he's going to be better as the split goes on. He was by far this team's best player last year, expecting better things from him. The problem is that Kepler and Jinzhao are just awful as a bot lane. They were good enough to be able to win here. Jinzhao's not atrocious, like he is a capable support. I still don't think Kepler can play at this level, and this series certainly did nothing to change my opinion on that, but the top side of the map was good enough. Specifically, the solo laners were good enough for LGD to be able to take this series in the last 2 games. But for Ultra Prime, surprisingly, maybe some positives to take away from this series, more so than anything that I've seen from this team up until this point this year. Mostly that Hacker was actually really good in game number 1 on the Maokai. Talk about some phenomenal team fighting, some phenomenal positioning, and just general good map awareness. I'm surprised to see Hacker actually start off the year relatively fine. For Ultra Prime, Uakai had a field day. I think in game 1 on the Akali, when he actually was allowed to do so, his mechanics and his decision-making are just so much better on assassin champions than they are on things with low mobility. Keep him on those champions. Decade is a very interesting player. The player that I compare him to the most is a player like Rich. If you guys remember how Rich played in the LPL, where it's like, oh god, take laning phase away. This guy is a complete liability in lane. Like, he cannot go one-on-one with anybody, but he's a pretty good team fighter. Very similar to what we talked about with Rich. I don't think he's as good as Rich is as a player, but, he's interesting. He had a really good set of team fights in the back half of game number 1 on the Cassante, but also I'm pretty sure I could pilot that champion and still be competent at the LPL level. Again, similar to what I said about LGD, the problem for Ultra Prime is the bot lane, and it's not Jue, who I think is a really good player. He is very decisive. He is certainly going to go out there and try to win the game for you, which is a good thing, but Doggo is just so passive. He's so nothing right now. He's going to get my dud of the series. He's just, so slow in terms of how he plays the game. I'm not sure if it's a lack of confidence. I think that is a very likely thing to say with everything that happened on Bilibili Gaming and now moving in here to a really bad Ultra Prime team. I think it's very possible that Doggo's confidence is just completely shot, but he is scared to do anything. He's just sitting back and poking in team fights, and then dying. And that's really it. Like, that's all he does. And if you're getting outplayed and outpoked by Kepler, like on the other side, that's bad. I don't even know if Kepler was better, but I don't know. Doggo was just as bad, and that's just as negative of a statement as I could possibly give. Ultra Prime is just going to be a bad team if they continue to have Doggo play like this, because Uakai's not good enough to carry this team to wins. Hacker is not good enough to carry this team to wins. Decade is not good enough to carry this team to wins. I don't know where they're going to get any wins. They lost to LGD. This was going to be their easiest test of the year. They got it super early on, and they couldn't quite get it done. It's concerning for what this team is going to look like for the rest of 2024. I think 0-16 absolutely is in play. I'm never going to predict a team to do that, because a lot would have to go wrong for you to never win a series, but this is certainly going to set it up for it to be a lot more difficult for them. And then for LGD, they're still not a good team. Kepler and Jinzhao continue to be one of the weaker lanes, not just bot lanes, in all of the LPL, but Bertle and Haichao, I think, are legit players in Meteor. I would expect to look better once he's not on Maokai, because, again, he's a carry player. He's somebody who likes Graves, he likes Kindred, he likes these more aggressive picks, and so I think when the team starts playing into that, he'll look better. LGD is just whatever, right? They're still one of the bottom two teams, in my opinion, but at the very least, what they proved in this series is that they're not the number one bottom team in the LPL. And then moving on to our third series of day 6 here, our final series of the first weekend day, and it's a pretty big classic here in the LPL, a real rivalry. Top Esports taking on Edward Gaming. We've seen these teams face off a lot, and as per usual, it's Top Esports coming out on top. I don't know why this org always seems to have EDG's number, but it's pretty consistent over the last few years, this time significantly less surprising than it is normally. Top Esports is definitely the better of these two teams, no matter what happened in their first series, and that was very clear in these two games that TES was able to come out on top in. Really happy to see the solo laners in particular for TES really, perform very well. I think a lot of people were talking about 369 being elo held in their first series. Wasn't necessarily as on the train for that. I think 369 is obviously a really good player, and, I think the rest of this team is still really good players, and you were facing Bilibili. I wasn't ready to just say that 369 has joined a really bad team after leaving JD Gaming, and obviously that take has looked pretty good here, because the two players that underperformed the most in that first series, Tian and Cream, I think both looked very good and definitely outclassed their opponents in this one. Player of the series for me is going to go to Cream in the mid lane. Really happy to see that bounce back performance. I've been talking all offseason about how important Cream is in 2024. He is genuinely one of the players that will determine who competes for the title in the LPL, because I think that this team is good enough to be able to compete for an LPL championship this year. But Cream has to be able to go up against all the other mids in the LPL and stand toe-to-toe in major matchups. Obviously, he still has a lot to work to do to prove that. He was not very good against Knight in their first series, but taking advantage of, quite frankly, a pretty bad mid laner at the current moment in Fisher, or at least what we've seen from him has been pretty bad through the first two series. He looked amazing in this one. He got to play signature Akali in game number 1 and looked awesome. Still looked fantastic on the Tristana in game 2, but most of this player of the game is for that Akali game in game 1, which was probably the best game of this series from either team. Really good stuff from Cream. I want to give a big shout out to Mako. Obviously, pretty personal game for Mako, gets to play against Edward Gaming, his lifelong team at this point. He left in the offseason when people really weren't expecting him to. He went over to TES kind of as a last-ditch replacement when they weren't able to get Ming, and honestly, Mako looked like he had it out for him this game. He was amazing in this series. Him and Jackie Love seem to have pretty good chemistry. Jackie hasn't exactly been a big focal point for what Top Esports has wanted to do through their first couple of series of the year so far, but we know he's talented enough to be an MVP caliber player like he was last year, and I think Mako definitely enables that. Mako feels like he's much happier, much more confident on this roster with this set of players than he was last year on EDG, in my opinion, especially once Uzi got there. So really nice to see that. Like I said, 369 was really good, won both sides of this matchup, and Ale really kind of just outclassed him in this matchup, which we will get into more on the EDG side. But generally, Top Esports looked really good in this series. This is much more of the speed I was expecting from a team that I really think at worst should be a top 3, top 4 team in the LPL. I think this was much more of what you were expecting out of that. And then for EDG on the other side, obviously there are concerns with this team, but, the concerns are very real. There are very, big worries about how this team could compete in 2024, because so far it really has not looked all that good. I want to dissuade the idea that they're guaranteed to be bad, though. They faced RNG and Top Esports. They still were able to win a game against RNG, and so obviously it could be worse. It's been two good teams that they've played into. I want to see what happens when this team actually starts to play against some rosters that aren't as stacked, as mechanically talented as the ones they've played into, but so far they've just not been able to keep up with anybody that they've played against. Their macro has been abysmal, and it does not feel like this team has any synergy. Dud of the series, take your pick, man. It's literally any of the 5. You could give it to anybody. I would very narrowly gave this to Fisher, who has been one of the worst mid laners in the LPL so far, but I'm going to give it to Ale on the top side. He was definitely the best player Vampire in their first series against RNG. He was the one actually being able to keep pace, and actually create some advantages for that team, for EDG, when they were able to win a game there in that series, but it has not been the case in this one against Top Esports. 369 is a little bit too tough of a challenge. Ale lost in both of these matchups in lane pretty hard. He kind of looked awful in this series, really looked out of his depth, lost a bit. I'm not going to say that Ale is going to continue that, but this is a player that should be better than this. In my opinion, he's a top 3 to 4 top laner in the LPL, and this was just not a performance that was indicative of that. Like I said, Jeje got completely outjungled by Tion in both of these games. Even the aggressive plays he made were pretty bad. Fisher is just not mechanically good enough to be able to compete with a player like Cream. Game 1 was a slaughter. Fisher was miserable. And Leave and Vampire are just not very good. Leave is just a mediocre AD carry right now. Just feels like somebody who's blending into the background and not accomplishing anything except for dying when the assassin dives onto him in the backline. And Vampire is one of the worst supports in the LPL, full stop, at least in terms of how he's performed through the first couple of series. EDG looks really bad, if I'm being honest. I just don't want to say that this is guaranteed to be who they are throughout the rest of this year. I mean, this team has, like I said, played 2 of the top 5-ish teams in the LPL right now, and that's a really tough start. Before I start freaking out about them not being able to win games, I want to see them lose to some of the teams that we don't project to be playoff teams. That's when it starts to become a problem. For now, it's just this team looking really outclassed when they play some of the better teams in the league. But for Top Esports, they are one of the better teams in the league. Lost to Bilibili, notwithstanding, this team has, had a pretty strong start to the year. 369 looks really good. I think Cream gets his signature pick in this one and looks solid on it. Mako looks revitalized, and I think Jackie Love and Tion as the holdovers here from Top Esports are certainly good enough to be able to win with, but the expectation for this team is to compete for an LPL title this year. Are they going to be able to do that? Time will tell, but this is a pretty good step. I think at least after week 1, you feel pretty good that they're at least going to be in the conversation about that. And now we finally get to move into our 7th and final day of action here in the LPL in week number 1, and we kicked off day number 7 with a matchup between ThunderTalk Gaming and Weibo Gaming. That Weibo was able to pick up the win in. They moved to 4-0 to start their season, and this is looking pretty good for them. I was a bit concerned after Demacia Cup. They had that unceremonious exit against Ninjas in Pyjamas, and I really didn't know what they were going to be going into 2024. There were concerns about whether topside was going to be good enough. That certainly wasn't answered in the first series. There were concerns about whether the bot side was good enough to continuously keep up with a landscape in the LPL that got better over the course of the offseason. Even if I like Zhao Hao as an addition, I think he is an upgrade to this team, or at the very least, a side grade to this team. There were concerns about just whether or not this team was good enough to continue to be a top 4 team. I think they're very much at least in the running at the current moment. There are a lot of good teams in the LPL. Basically, everybody at the top ended up proving they deserved to be there, and so for Weibo, this is a nice win. For ThunderTalk, obviously had that huge win earlier this week against LNG that looked really good. You were really excited and really happy about that. This one, not so much. This definitely looked like a different version of ThunderTalk, mostly because, maybe I was a bit wrong, and we'll get to that about Beishuan. Maybe it is, time to start saying that, I can only defend him for so long, but, we'll talk about that when we get to the ThunderTalk section. We'll talk about Weibo first and foremost. Starting with player of the series, which, it's going to ZDZ in the top lane, and you're damn right he earned it in this one. Really good Aatrox game in game number 2. That's really what he's getting this for, is being able to carry that second game with a lot of those team fights. The really good Aatroxes know how to separate a team. That's really something that I've noticed in the pro scene, is what top tier Aatrox players like to do is find out who the big priority targets on the enemy team are, and not to always get on top and stay on top of them, because that is something that is quite difficult against the best players in the world, but most notably to separate them from the people that are supposed to be keeping them safe, the peel on the team, whether that's Nocturne, whether that's Milio, whoever it ends up being, on this draft for ThunderTalk. I think ZDZ did a great job of staying on top of the Orianna, staying on top of the Aphelios, and keeping things from getting out of control to allow the rest of his team to essentially just take down that front line while he's keeping the backline occupied and making it a lot easier to end up playing. So credit to ZDZ, this was significantly better than his first series that he had earlier this week, and this is kind of what you're looking for. This was a pretty good performance, and I know people love the shy, and I know people love to shit on ZDZ because you see it a lot in the Reddit threads, but you know, there's a chance that this is like a regular season upgrade for this team. The Shy was amazing at Worlds, but, I mean, he takes a lot of games off. Like, there were a lot of games that he just doesn't try in, that he's clearly not focused on. ZDZ's never really had that problem. He's struggled, you know, playing on bad teams, I think, in the past, but he's also been a player that I've compared to someone like Cube in the past, where it's like, he's pretty good when he's given resources. So, you know, interesting to see him have a good game here. I think it's also worth noting, Light and Crisp continue to look awesome as an LPL bot lane. Again, not the most exciting bot lane in the entire world in terms of the action and the aggression that they're going to give you. They're not Elkanon in terms of the mentality and the playstyle that they play with, but talent-wise, they're right up there with Elkanon in terms of what they actually offer. I think Light and Crisp are very good. They were great last year. They continue to be great, at least at the start of this split. Crisp is another player that is going to continue to get underrated every single split. He was awesome here again. Shout out Xiaohao. Love when he plays something like Nocturne. He's really aggro on those picks. I'm usually not a fan of Nocturne Nico. I think it's kind of bait as a combo because I think oftentimes the Nocturne's going in just to die, and the Nico's pretty viable without the Nocturne anyways. Usually pairing it up with something that can CC down targets a little bit easier is better in my opinion. At times that looked to be the case in game number 1, but Xiaohao's so good at Nocturne that honestly it ends up not mattering. Shout out to Xiaohu. He tried his best to throw away game number 1 on the Nico. Holy crap, he was not good in that game. He was trying his best to just completely int it away. Shout out Yucal, who was just straight up better than Xiaohu in this game, but, you know, it was good. ZDZ was good enough. Xiaohao, Light, and Crisp were all good enough for Weibo to be able to walk away with the win. And then for ThunderTalk, like I said, Yucal continues to look amazing for this team, even in defeat. Really good to see Yucal just continuing to put on that pace as one of the best mid laners in the world at the current moment. He ended off last year on that pace, and I certainly think that has continued here. 1xN and Chocho, I think, have good synergy and chemistry together. There were times where they just looked a little bit outclassed going up against Light and Crisp in terms of the aggressiveness and what they could offer in the isolated 2v2, but I'm not super worried about that. Light and Crisp are one of the best bot lanes in the LPL. The concern for me is jungle here. It's going to be Beishuan. I like his aggressiveness. I typically like his shot calling, but I'm not afraid to admit when I am wrong on this channel. I think anybody who's followed me over the past few years knows I'm not afraid to sit here and be like, this was a take that I didn't end up getting 100% right. I've been defending Beishuan for a while, but I think the decline in talent is definitely starting to show a bit more. I still think shot calling is very important, and by all accounts, he's a very important member of this team, and this doesn't change the idea that I think Zhao Huanggren as a prospect still needs a lot of tuning to go to get like an LPL shape, but there are really good junglers out there that I think could make this team pretty relevant. I mean, Tarzan's still available. Tarzan plus Yucal could be such a scary duo. Someone like Shadow, who I thought was really good last year, is available potentially for this team. If Beishuan really isn't your answer here, just because I don't think Zhao Huanggren is the answer doesn't mean that you can't find another answer that I think would be good, because this was a pretty bad series, and I understand where people are coming from. I still think he offers more to this team than people are giving him credit for, but the micro is really where he struggles. Not the decision-making, but the mechanics of how he goes about a lot of these team fights, I think, is really starting to show itself to be negative. I think some of that comes with playing Nocturne in game number 2, though. I'm definitely going to say that, but he is my dud of the series here. Hoya is just nothing on the top side. He got destroyed by ZDZ. That should show you how bad Hoya is. He was one of the worst top laners in the league last year. He has certainly not re-cemented himself as a good player so far this year. As much as I like Yucal and as much as I think 1xN and Chocho are going to be a fun bot lane to watch, I don't know what the ceiling of this team really looks like. I think going up against a genuinely good team here in Weibo that isn't struggling to figure something out like LNG was earlier this week definitely illuminated some of the more pressing concerns. Do I think this could be a playoff team? Absolutely. I still think that's on the table for them for sure. Am I guaranteeing that happening? Certainly not at this point. I think that this series definitely exposed some of the flaws that they have in their current iteration. But for Weibo on the other side, really like how this team is constructed. Light and Crisp are the core of this team, and even with Xiaohu really not playing all that well to start this split, they're still able to win games relatively easily. That should make it a lot better when Xiaohu does inevitably get back into form. Xiaohao's great. ZDZ looked really good in this series. This team is pretty solid. I'm still not sold that they're going to be top 4, but at least for now, they're interesting to watch. And now moving on to our second series of the final day here, and it was another intriguing one, mostly because it's finally the debut of one of the most interesting teams in the league. It's Rare Atom taking on JD Gaming, and JDG is going to be able to get it done into pretty quick work here. Worth noting, Flandre is in the top lane. That is something that I am definitely interested in seeing. Flandre is a very good player, somebody who I would consider to be a borderline top 5 top laner in the LPL, depending on how he comes back to form. Worth noting, he was only okay in this game. I don't necessarily think in these 2 games he was dominant in any way. He was just kind of there, and the rest of the team ended up winning the series, but that means Sheer is not in the lineup, and that removes a lot of the volatility that I think this team was going to experience at the beginning part of the year. Now, I want to make it clear, I don't know why Flandre is in. I'm not saying that I have any sort of special information on the situation, but there are a lot of people who do have special information on the situation, and pretty much all of them told me that Sheer was starting this year, that he was going to be the guy. I know there's a rule in the LPL that you can only play if you've played a certain amount of competitive games. I thought they were trying to get around that by playing Sheer in Demacia Cup. I'm not sure if it wasn't enough games or if they just genuinely wanted to go with Flandre. Whatever the reason, it's definitely a higher floor kind of thing for Flandre to be in here. I just wonder if Flandre is going to look like just a fine top laner. That's certainly kind of been the rumor surrounding him in a lot of these scrims and why they were looking at Sheer in the first place. But Flandre is in the top lane here, and Rare Adam is just not going to be able to compete with JD Gaming. JDG is really freaking good, arguably still the #1 team in the LPL. I mean, them and Bilibili were my S tier in terms of LPL teams for a reason, and I think both of that got proven this week. JDG continuing to follow that up here with their first series of the year. So let's talk about it. Player of the series to me is going to go to Ruler in the bot lane. I talked about Knight, being the best player in the world for me. And, obviously those two as teammates last year, Knight being somebody that's up there. Ruler is really the only player in my mind that can really contest him for that role, in my opinion. At least with what we've seen over the course of the last 2 years or so, I think those are your top 2 players in the world. Ruler was able to play Lucian and make him look like the most broken champion on the planet. Obviously, we know how good he is on that champion. It's basically tailor-made for his playstyle, but still at the end of the day, we've seen other players really struggling to play it internationally, and Ruler just never is going to have those issues. He's too good at Lucian, and he's just awesome at following up with damage, at being aggressive in the AD carry role. He's super fun to watch. He wasn't the only player on this team to play well. Missing obviously enabled him well on the Nami, but really the standouts for me are the middle 3 on JD Gaming. It was Ruler, it was Yagao, who looked awesome in his debut, or his re-debut, I guess, for JD Gaming. I think, honestly, it was really enlightening to see that this team played super similarly to how this team played in 2022, not 2023. Obviously, 2022 is looked at as kind of still a very good year for JD Gaming, but not as good of a year as 2023 because of the super team, whatever. They won everything. They won MSI in 2023, but they were still a world semifinalist. They were still a top 4 team in the world in 2022. And, I think Yagao coming back has really inspired it to be kind of similar, playing through Kanavi a lot early and then trying to get their bot laner onto something that can be proactive in the mid game. I think obviously their bot laner is way better now, but, Yagao coming back and playing so well on the Azir actually really reminded me of 2022 JD Gaming, so take with that what you will, but Kanavi was also phenomenal in this series. That Rel in game number 1 was a blast. The Jarvan in game number 2, the amount of creations he was able to make on that champion, it's just very impressive stuff. I think Kanavi, Yagao, Ruler, really the 3 standouts. Missing continued to look good. Like I said, Flandre was more kind of just there. He really didn't do anything in this series. Got to play Aatrox and Udyr, and in both games was there in lane, was relatively even, and then just was there in team fights. So you can live with that. Kanavi, Yagao, Ruler, and Missing are certainly good enough to have somebody who's just going to survive on the top side, but I wasn't really blown back by what I saw from Flandre in this one. I think Ruler was definitely the carry, but nice to see Kanavi and Yagao reignite that great synergy that they had 2 years ago. And then for Rare Adam on the other side, it sucks because this team was so good at Demacia Cup. They were a top 4 team at that tournament. They made semifinals of Demacia Cup when basically everybody was playing exclusively their starters. They had a rough go of it in the first week. They played 2 really good teams, Weibo Gaming, JD Gaming. I'm not going to sit here and try to hold it against them that they couldn't quite get over the 2 teams that performed best from the LPL last year, but there is some concerns. Dead of the series is once again going to go to Vikla in the mid lane. Really sad to say that his week 1 was really not good. And again, I know a lot of people didn't watch Demacia Cup, but the reason it's so sad that his week 1 wasn't very good is his Demacia Cup was awesome. He was absolutely destroying that tournament. He looked amazing against some very good players, specifically against Scout in the mid lane. And, I was really hoping that this is going to be kind of the reignition of Vikla. Things fell apart in North America, but once he gets the confidence back, he's going to be good. It didn't happen in week 1. Yes, it's against 2 good teams, but I am a bit concerned that, we're starting to get to the point where it's like, well, Vikla, you got to show up or shut up, and he didn't quite show up in week number 1. Again, it's just week 1 against 2 good teams, so I don't want to overreact, but he was certainly outplayed by Yagao in this series, and it's something to keep an eye on. Nayu was not nearly as good as he was in the first series, but again, he's going into Kanavi, the best jungler in the world. I'm going to cut him a bit of slack. Asum and Zora were actually pretty solid in this series. Really nice to see that they actually have pretty good synergy as a duo. I was interested to see whether or not they were making a mistake not going with someone like Xiaoxi, who is a lot more experienced, a lot more I would say stable in terms of what he offers in the support position, but Zora seems to have really nice synergy with the rest of this team. I think that could be useful. I think Assume is still fine. Still don't see the upside that everybody else sees in him, but, he's a good player, and I thought he had a good series here against Ruler and Missing, which is a good thing to say. And Xiaoshu, I thought, was solid on the top side, was mostly fine into Flandre, and generally had a pretty solid impact, didn't really make any mistakes, but mid-jungle was a bit of a problem. Mid lane in particular, I think, was definitely the standout role that was most negatively, kind of there for Rare Adam in this series. And again, if Vikla can figure things out like he did in Demacia Cup, when Vikla was rolling, this team was really good. I thought the top side of Xiaoshu, Neyu, and Vikla was actually going to be really solid heading into the LPL. I think we're going to get a better idea of that as the weeks continue to go on, as they play teams that are a little bit closer to their skill level, but at least for now, there are concerns with the first couple of series that we've seen from Rare Adam, maybe a bit more so than I was expecting heading into the season. But for JD Gaming, really nice way to start your year, obviously. Very late start. The last day of week number 1 to get your first series is certainly odd, but they ended up making it worth the while because it was a really good showing. If top lane gets figured out, I'm not even saying it's going to be a problem, but, if you get better performances out of Flandre, this team is going to be just as good as they were last year, and that's a very dangerous proposition, especially with a team like Bilibili potentially getting even better. I've always said, or I've said over the course of this video, that Bilibili and JDG are very dangerous teams, and that the top of the LPL has gotten even better over the course of this offseason. I think that was only proven in a series like this. And then moving into our final series of the week here on this channel, in the LPL at the very least, the third series of day number 7. It was OMG taking on LNG Esports, and LNG is going to be able to pick up their first win of the year, calming the storm, at least for now. This was a very solid win from LNG, a very team effort, a very well-rounded win, I would say, from this team, but it still doesn't quell every single fear that I have for them, because OMG is not exactly the most consistent team on the entire planet. They're a team that is certainly in consideration for falling out of one of the top 10 spots. I don't know if there's 10 playoff teams right now that I feel comfortable about in the LPL, but OMG certainly hasn't guaranteed themselves one of those spots, and generally, I think, obviously, they did not look good down the stretch. They had to make a change in the bot lane after game number 1. We will talk about that, but really nice win for LNG. Really happy to see them stabilize in a position where they can actually just go out and win a game, and I think a lot of it having to do with the fact that they were able to control the map with macro is a really good sign. It's a stabilization sign. If their, meta read isn't quite perfect at the current moment, then maybe you just got to go out and outplay it anyways, and I think that ended up happening here. Let's talk about it. Player of the series is going to go to Weiwei. This is no surprise to anybody who watched these games. I think one of the more encouraging signs for me from LNG here is that when they did stabilize, it was through jungle. That was something that I was a bit concerned about. Was Weiwei going to come in and, as a, pace changer, really affect this team in a negative way? Not that I think Weiwei's a bad player. I may be hard on him at times on this channel, but I still think Weiwei's relatively fine. I had him at the same grade as Tarzan was last year. I think they're relatively similar. I don't think this is a massive downgrade for LNG or anything, but I was concerned about the shift in mentality that this team was going through, bringing in Weiwei, bringing in Mark. Clearly, the idea is to be more aggressive. We talked about that with Mark earlier in the week. Weiwei also fits that. He's very much a more early game focused, wanting to snowball the game, kind of jungler. He doesn't want to be passive. He wants to be aggressive, and that's not always how LNG played their games last year, and at least at the start of this year, I was worried that playstyle change was affecting them in a pretty negative way. It's really nice to see Weiwei continuing to be aggressive, I should say, and actually making this team better because of it here in this series. It was really nice to see him play the Vi in game 1 and the Poppy in game 2 and really control a lot of the tempo, and the team was following up on a lot of the plays he was making. That was the most encouraging thing. Gala and Mark looked awesome in this series. They gapped the hell out of Starry and PP God in that first game. Abel and PP God were slightly better in game 2, but Ezreal Karma's just not going to be able to do all that much once the team is super far behind like they were. Scout was amazing, looked so much better than he did at any point so far in 2024, whether that be Demacia Cup or whether that be their first series of the year. Scout actually finally looked like Scout in this series, which is really nice to say, specifically on the Corki in game number 1 where he just mega gapped Azir in the other matchup. And then I thought Zika was awesome into Cube. Cube is really starting to concern me. He has lost lane like every single time I've paid attention, and that is really a bad thing to say. Like, he was really bad in lane last year on WE, and going into 2024, you were hoping that potentially that would change, but topside looks like it's going to be a pretty big weakness for OMG, and that's really not what you were looking for. But really nice overall cohesive win from LNG, basically exactly what you wanted to see. I know I say that a lot, but you needed this one. I think for confidence sake, if you started off the year 0-2, I would be, close to hitting the panic mode button for a team that I think really expected themselves to be in the upper echelon, the top 4 of the LPL. If you started 0-2, that would have been a disaster. This is a nice win for them. And then for OMG on the other side, you know, it wasn't a good series, but are you really all that surprised? I mean, this team isn't really all that good, if we're being honest. Cube, like I said earlier, is just kind of getting mega gapped in every matchup right now. Doesn't really matter what he plays. Kasante's super strong. Obviously, it's not Rumble, but you should be able to at least survive in those matchups, as we've seen basically everybody play that champion survive, and he certainly wasn't able to do that. This was the first series where I really felt like Zhao Feng was just way out of his depth. They played 3 series this week. The first 2, I'm like, oh, he's kind of interesting as a jungle prospect. Really interesting player in terms of the early game aggression, but here is really where it kind of fell off. I honestly think the Nocturne game in Game 2 was better, but Maokai in Game 1 was miserable. That was a very bad performance, and Weiwei kind of made some of his flaws a little bit more noticeable in this one. Angel was not nearly as good as Scout. This was a demolition, specifically in Game 1. And then Starry was so bad he had to be subbed out. He's going to get done of the series, even though he only played 1 game, because that 1 game was so bad that they had to move into a different direction. They had to put Abel back in. It was only a matter of time before they did this. Let's be honest, Starry was not good in any of the games that he played at the LPL level this week, but, you know, it'll be interesting to see if they continue to make this more of a 6-man or if Abel's just going to have the job back. You would certainly hope for the latter if this team wants to be competitive, but who knows? PP God continues to not look good without Abel in the lineup. They certainly looked better in Game 2 once they played the Ezreal Karma, but like I said, what are you really going to do on Ezreal Karma once this team is super far behind in Game 2? So for OMG, I'm not going to say I'm freaking out. I'm not going to say they're guaranteed not a playoff team. This team's bottom 3 or bottom 4 or whatever. Again, no overreactions on this channel, but what I am saying is that this team isn't particularly phenomenal in their current state. They're going to need to get better moving into the rest of the season. OMG always kind of front loads their games. They have so many games at the beginning of the year. They played 3 series in week number 1. You know, they're not going to have as many chances as they continue to go on. Hopefully this team can get it together quickly, because I think the expectations are higher than what the current performance is at. But again, really nice win for LNG. Really necessary win to kind of quell and calm some of the fears that they had at the beginning of the split after really not looking good. Hopefully they can continue the momentum. I mean, things are going to get harder from here. OMG is not exactly the most difficult opponent in the world, but, you know, if everybody can play up to their standard that we know they can play at, I'm not going to freak out about LNG. I'm going to give them a bit more time. Maybe they can develop into something that's great. It's just right now, I'm really not sold on them 100% being there. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Week 1 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed the craziness of all 17 series that we covered here. Up on the screen now is the updated Week 1 standings in the LPL. Of course, any ties are just going to be broken alphabetically. We're still in the stage where there is a lot of ties. Teams just haven't played a lot of games yet. Let's go over what you're seeing on the screen. Of course, like I said, all of the teams are ordered in terms of their standings, and so you can see NIP, Weibo Gaming on top because they're 2-0 in terms of series score and 4-0 in terms of game score, which make them, you know, the only teams in number 1. BLG comes in at 3 because they lost a game to Top Esports, etc. You get how this works. But the columns to the right, the first column that says power ranking, that's where I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 17. The second column, that's how they have changed from last week to this week in my personal power ranking. So let's go over the risers and fallers just so you guys are aware of everything that has changed. 1 and 2, untouched, as they should be. Bilibili and JD Gaming are still the 2 top teams in the league. I don't really see why there would be a reason to think otherwise, at least at the current moment. Then you get to number 3. I still have Top Esports there. Yes, they lost to Bilibili, but they put up a fight. They actually won a game against them, and, you know, I think their win in the second half of the week against EDG really proved that they're one of the best teams in the league still, and until proven otherwise, they're going to be in that top 3. But a newcomer into the top 4, it's Ninjas in Pyjamas jumping up to number 4. They just played so well as a group and a unit this week. I feel very confident in them, more confident than any of the other teams, which is why I dropped LNG down to number 5. I considered keeping them at number 4 and only putting NIP up to number 5. I considered dropping LNG down to number 6 as well and putting Weibo Gaming up to number 5 as well, but I ended up somewhere in the middle. LNG I still think has a lot to prove to me. They did not look good this week, but I want to give this team time to figure out what their playstyle is and how they want to mesh their players into it. That means Weibo Gaming moves up to number 6, and one of the bigger fallers this week is going to be RNG. They moved down 2 spots to number 7. That's a pretty significant drop, as you can see from some of the other changes. I just don't feel very confident in this team right now. They feel towards the bottom of these more competitive teams at the moment. Maybe it's because they played some good teams this week, or I guess they didn't. They played EDG, but they got blasted by Bilibili, and honestly, I'm concerned with the overall consistency of what this team is going to offer. So for now, they fall to number 7. Number 8 stays the same with WE. It feels like they're kind of in a tier of their own, and then we start to get to some questions. Maybe controversially, OMG and EDG are still going to round out number 9 and number 10 for me in my power rankings, if only because I just don't trust any of the teams that are below them right now to guarantee put them into the top 10. If one of, you know, ThunderTalk or Anyone's Legend or FunPlus Phoenix or even Rare Atom or Invictus Gaming or literally literally any of them, figure something out, go on a streak of wins, and prove that they could be a playoff team, it's going to be pretty on site, because I don't really trust OMG or EDG at the moment. I just can't really guarantee you that any of the teams below them are going to be better, and they should have superior talent, so they're going to stay there for now. Again, I try not to overreact with a lot of my power ranking changes, but ThunderTalk is going to jump up to 11. That's a jump of 2. They look like the best of the rest right now, and if any team is going to break into that top 10, I think it'll probably be them. I've got Anyone's Legend staying at 12. Good team, not really all that different from what I thought they were going to be. FPX is actually going to jump up to 13. I think right now, Dectum played really well in week 1. I think Milky Way is a really interesting piece for this team. I think someone like Zhao Lao could be good. There are interesting reasons to believe that FPX could be better than the number 15 that I gave them. Invictus is going to stay at 14, and then the biggest faller of the week, Rare Adam, going down from number 11 to number 15. A great Demacia Cup, a really good first showing, just did not translate at all into any week 1 success. Now, this leash on number 15 is very, very short, because at the end of the day, they lost to 2 pretty good teams, or at least 2 semi-competent teams in Weibo Gaming and in JD Gaming, 2 genuinely solid teams, and it's not a bad thing to lose to them, but if they come out against Invictus and they just look lifeless and they don't look good and Vikla continues to underperform and struggle, then yeah, this 15 spot's probably going to be deserved, but it's a short leash, like I said, on this number 15. I think number 11 to number 15 is all basically the same grade from me. Honestly, number 9 to number 15 right now is basically all the same grade in the LPL, which is pretty crazy to say, and then bottom 2 teams, pretty clear to me. LGD, yes, was able to beat Ultra Prime, but Ultra Prime is clearly the worst team in League of Legends right now, or at least in the LPL, and LGD is certainly not too far behind that, at least in my opinion. So those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comments. I'm sure we're not going to agree on everything as long as the conversation stays relatively cordial. I'll be happy to have that with you guys. But moving on to the final slide of the video, and that's going to be my player of the week and my dud of the week. For those of you who haven't been watching my coverage of other regions, I do have a new slide for this now. I know typically it's kind of just been something I talked about, but I wanted to experiment with some slides here, and so you can see the player of the week and the dud of the week up on the screen now. Player of the week, pretty easy choice for me. It's going to go to Knight in the mid lane. And I know, again, some people are going to be like, another Knight fanboy just going on and on about him. I don't really know what else to say at this point. If you're watching Knight, if you're watching the games and you don't see one of the best players in the world, I really don't know what else to tell you. He played 2 series this week and he looked phenomenal in both, so he's going to get my player of the week. Runners up, super strong weeks out of Rookie, out of Crisp. I think both of them were really good for their respective teams, who both looked really good. I think both of them deserve shouts, but to me, Knight is definitely the player of the week. And then dud of the week for week 1, again, this was also pretty easy. Gonna go to Vikla for Rare Adam. I thought he was definitely the worst player in the LPL this week. He's gonna have to be better. Again, he was so good in Demacia Cup that it honestly pains me to see how bad he was in week number 1. Hopefully he can get some of that confidence back, bounce back a little bit. I really didn't like what I saw. I considered someone like Starry from OMG for this role, but really at the end of the day, this could only go to Vikla for Rare Adam. But that is going to do it. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know in the comment section below. Leave a like if you did enjoy the video. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys enjoy the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL basically every weekday on this channel, and so if you want comprehensive overviews of everything happening in LoL Esports basically across the entire year, this is the place for it. Hit that subscribe button, hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.